Chapter 1. The End of the Caliphate. The Rise of a Kingdom. In the soft winter light of January 1492, the red fortress of the Alhambra stood silent. Its towers, once bright with the banners of Islamic rule, now shimmered with a quiet surrender. Snow dusted the distant peaks of the Sierra Nevada, as if nature itself was pausing to witness the end of an age. This was Granada, the last stronghold of Al-Andalus, the final echo of a centuries-long Moorish presence on the Iberian Peninsula. For nearly 800 years, Muslim dynasties had ruled over parts of Spain, bringing with them architecture that kissed the heavens and scholars who translated the stars. But all empires fade. And now, after a long siege, the once glorious emirate had bowed to the advancing Christian kingdoms. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, standing united, watched as the key to the city was surrendered. The moment was not loud, no trumpet pierced the sky. But in the silence, a shift could be felt across the land. Spain, long fractured into kingdoms, was no longer a land divided between crescent and cross. The Reconquista, the centuries-old effort to retake Iberia, had reached its solemn, final breath. The surrender of Granada did more than reclaim land. It symbolized spiritual victory. For the Christian world, it was the triumph of the faith over centuries of perceived exile. And for Spain, it was a moment of unity forged not in peace, but in fire. The Catholic monarchs, backed by the church and cheered by their armies, stood at the edge of something new. No longer confined to the tangled politics of Iberia, they could now look beyond, toward the open seas, toward lands unknown, toward empire. Yet behind the pageantry of victory was an undercurrent of sorrow. The Muslims of Granada, promised safe passage and the right to keep their faith, would soon find those promises broken. Mosques would fall silent. Arabic texts would be burned. A way of life, refined and radiant, began to vanish. And in its place, a singular vision of Catholic Spain began to rise. Unyielding, ambitious, and ready to step onto the world stage. Ferdinand and Isabella. One crown, one future. In the years before Granada fell, another quieter revolution had begun, one not of swords, but of vows. In 1469, Prince Ferdinand of Aragon married Princess Isabella of Castile. The union was not a simple romance, though affection did exist. It was a political weaving of two powerful thrones into one cloth. Their marriage would do what centuries of war had failed to accomplish. It would unite the heart of Iberia under a single Catholic vision. Together, they ruled not as one monarch, but as two, each retaining their own laws, courts, and councils, yet speaking with a shared voice. That voice would come to shape the destiny of Europe and the fate of continents far beyond it. Ferdinand, pragmatic and strategic, saw the world through the eyes of a warrior king. Isabella, devout and determined, viewed it through the lens of divine purpose. Their strengths met like two rivers, one of earthly force, the other of heavenly will. The union of Castile and Aragon created more than political unity. It became a platform for ambition. Now with Granada subdued, the monarchs turned their attention outward. The Iberian Peninsula was no longer their boundary. It was their launching point. Trade, exploration, conquest. These were no longer dreams, but strategies. And yet, their vision would require more than military might. It would need ships. It would need navigators. It would need belief. In this vision of empire, Ferdinand and Isabella became more than rulers. They became symbols. To their people, they embodied divine favor. To their enemies, they were a force that could not be ignored. Their coat of arms bore the yoke and arrows, symbols of strength through unity, and unity was their legacy. Under their reign, the seeds of the Spanish Empire were planted, not yet grown, but already alive with purpose. What came next would stretch far beyond Iberia, but it began here, with a crown shared by two, worn as one, a land of knights and hunger. Though victorious, Spain in the late 15th century was far from wealthy. The wars of the Reconquista had drained its coffers and left many lands scarred. Castles stood tall, but villages nearby remained hungry. Fields were burned, roads crumbled, and the treasury was thin. Victory had come at a price. The nobility, proud and restless, returned from war to find their lands diminished and their future uncertain. This was a land of knights without battles, lords without wealth, and veterans who had tasted conquest, but now stood idle. The warrior spirit that had once defended the cross now searched for a new purpose. They were hungry, not just for food, but for land, for titles, for legacy. Many of these hidalgos, lesser nobles, owned little more than their name and their sword. They dreamed not of peace, but of new campaigns, far from the fields of Iberia. The hunger was not just material, it was spiritual, national, and deeply personal. The Catholic monarchs had lit a fire of belief that Spain was chosen, that God had favored them, that their destiny reached beyond their borders. And so the dream of empire took shape, not yet drawn on maps, but etched in the hearts of men who longed for glory. Exploration began to whisper in taverns and courtrooms. Talk of islands beyond the horizon, of gold, of spices, of people untouched by the gospel. Spain, once a land defended from invasion, now prepared to become the invader. Its knights would no longer ride across dusty Iberian plains. They would sail, and when they did, they would carry their hunger with them. But for now, that hunger remained coiled, like a spring pressed tight. The monarchs knew it. The court knew it. Even the church, flush with victory, felt the stirrings of something larger. The time of holy war was ending. The age of holy empire was about to begin. The shadow rival, Portugal's head start. While Spain was still finding its footing, its neighbor to the west had already begun its journey across the seas. Portugal, small but focused, had spent decades navigating the coasts of Africa and establishing trading posts far from home. Prince Henry the Navigator, though long gone by the 1480s, had laid the groundwork for a maritime empire. Lisbon hummed with stories of spices, gold, and strange lands bathed in sun. By the time Spain took Granada, Portugal had already claimed islands in the Atlantic, outposts on the African coast, and was inching closer to India. Portuguese ships, nimble and fast, were carving a path that would soon bring them great wealth. Their maps, secret and closely guarded, gave them an edge Spain did not yet have. Their sailors had learned the winds, the currents, the rhythm of the ocean. They were not dreaming of exploration, they were living it. This quiet head start did not go unnoticed. In the royal courts of Castile and Aragon, whispers of Portugal's success stirred unease. Spain's monarchs, newly united and freshly victorious, knew they were late to the race. And yet, they were not deterred. If Portugal had gone south and east, Spain would look west. Beyond the Atlantic lay mystery, and possibly a shortcut to wealth untold. It was in this climate of rivalry that a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus arrived at court. He spoke of a new route, not around Africa, but across the ocean. His ideas were bold, some said mad, But Ferdinand and Isabella, driven by faith and the fear of being outpaced, listened. Portugal had claimed the early chapters of oceanic discovery. Spain would write the rest. In time, this quiet race would turn fierce. Treaties would be signed, lines drawn across maps, oceans divided by invisible hands. But here, in this moment of emerging power, the Spanish Empire was still only an idea, a dream shaped by a marriage, fired by conquest, and sharpened by the hunger of a land still healing from war. The race had begun, and Spain, unified, devout, and restless, was ready to run. Chapter 2: A Sailor's Dream, a Monarch's Gamble. He was not born to nobility, nor raised in palaces of power. Cristobal Colon, known to the world as Christopher Columbus, came from the narrow, stone-laid streets of Genoa, the son of a humble weaver. His hands, early in life, were meant for thread and dye, but his eyes looked farther, always toward the sea. He was not a man of stillness. He was a man of charts, of ships, of endless questions. What lay beyond the horizon? Could one sail west to reach the riches of the East? He was not the first to ask this, but he was the one who refused to let go of the question. By the time he reached adulthood, Columbus had become more than a sailor. He was a navigator of dreams. His knowledge was shaped by maps drawn in candlelight, by mariners' tales carried over ale, by books that mingled astronomy with legend. Some thought the ocean too wide. Others believed monsters waited in the deep. But Columbus believed otherwise. He trusted in God, in geometry, and in his own fierce sense of destiny. He carried his plans first to Portugal. The Portuguese, already skilled in their eastern routes, listened, but they found him stubborn. He claimed the Indies could be reached by sailing west, a shortcut through the unknown. He asked not just for ships, but for titles, wealth, and honors. They declined. His vision was too bold, too expensive, and too uncertain. Rejection did not stop him. Columbus turned his face towards Spain. In a land still locked in its final war against the Moors, he became an outsider once more. He spoke with scholars and friars, pleaded with nobles, sought audiences at court. Many laughed, some listened, but none acted. Still, Columbus waited. He was not a man willing to let his dream die in silence. His faith in his mission never wavered. Though the door remained closed, he stood before it for years. Every denial only hardened his resolve. Every dismissal only deepened his belief. The map he followed was one no eye had seen, no hand had drawn. Only his heart could read it. He was, in many ways, alone, but he believed he was chosen. And that belief, fragile yet unshaken, kept him moving forward. Waiting on Granada, Spain, in the late 15th century was not yet a country of explorers. It was a kingdom still in battle. The final chapter of the Reconquista unfolded in Granada, where the last Moorish stronghold held against the Catholic monarchs. Troops marched, walls trembled, cities prayed. All eyes were fixed on the south, where centuries of conflict neared their end. In this time, Columbus's vision could find no fertile ground. The court had no appetite for distant oceans while its own soil remained contested. Even Isabella, known for her curiosity and faith, could not yet afford to support such a gamble. Her resources were tied to war, her attention to siege. The ocean would have to wait. So Columbus waited too. He lingered in quiet places, walking monastery gardens, speaking with learned men, refining his plan. At the monastery of La Rábida, near the mouth of the Tinto River, he found shelter and sympathy. The friars there, learned in theology and science, believed in him. They wrote letters on his behalf. They prayed. They listened. And when the time came, they whispered his name into ears that mattered. As Granada neared collapse, the tide began to shift. With victory on the horizon, Spain would soon be ready to lift its gaze. The Moors would no longer define the kingdom's future. The crown, now whole and triumphant, would have room for new dreams, dreams that reached past the sunset. In the shadows of the Alhambra's fall, Columbus's proposal came to life again. Not because it had changed, but because Spain had. The very soil that had once rejected him was now ripe for expansion. The hunger for greatness, once fed by crusade, would soon turn to exploration. And in this hunger, a sailor's dream began to matter. The Royal Commission. In April of 1492, the same year that Granada surrendered, Columbus finally received the answer he had long sought. Queen Isabella, moved by persistence, by timing, and, perhaps by something deeper, agreed to fund his voyage. She had once said no, now she said yes. The difference was not in the plan, but in the world around it. Spain, victorious and united, now dared to dream. The agreement was formalized in the Capitulations of Santa Fe. It granted Columbus the titles he had long desired: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of lands discovered, and the right to a share of the riches he would find. It was a grand promise, given to a man who had never ruled, never led an army, never commanded more than his own stubborn vision. But the risk was accepted. Ships were gathered, 3 in all, not mighty vessels of war, but modest caravels, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Crews were recruited, many from the ports of Palos and Moga. They were not noblemen, but sailors, fishermen, men of the coast. Some were drawn by gold, others by duty, most by necessity. Few believed they would return. Columbus was now no longer an outcast. He was a man with royal blessing. His vision, once laughed at, had become Spain's boldest experiment. The ocean, silent for so long, began to stir with the creak of timber and the rustle of sailcloth. The ships were small, the crew uncertain, the mission unclear, but history had already begun to shift. When Columbus departed from Palos in August of 1492, he was not just sailing toward a new world. He was leaving behind a Europe still confined by its own maps, its own fears, its own horizon. And as the ships slipped from view, Spain held its breath, not in celebration, but in quiet wonder. What would he find? Would he return? Would he change the world? A journey into fog and faith. From the Canary Islands, the 3 ships set their course westward. The sea stretched vast and endless. No land rose to greet them, just waves, stars, and silence. The men watched the horizon each day, hoping for signs of something: birds, driftwood, change in the current. But nothing came. The world felt still, as if time itself had paused. Days turned into weeks. The wind was steady, but spirits were not. The ocean, so calm at first, began to wear on minds. Whispers spread among the crew, of turning back, of madness, of sailing off the edge. But Columbus stood firm. His faith was not only in God, but in direction, in pattern, in purpose. He watched the flight of birds, studied the swell of waves, noted every breeze. He believed land was near, even when none could see it. Each night, the stars lit the heavens. They became his guides, his compass, his constant companions. In their patterns, he found hope. In their silence, he found strength. This was not a journey of proof, but of trust. Trust in an idea. Trust in something more. On October 12, 1492, land was finally sighted. A cry rang out from the Pinta. Tierra, land. The journey that had begun in rejection and doubt ended in the soft sands of the Bahama Islands. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies. He had not. But the mistake did not matter, not yet. For Spain, the world had changed. The ocean was no longer a wall, it was a bridge, and Columbus, once an outcast, had become the first messenger of empire. What lay ahead would be complex, cruel, and vast. But in this moment, under a warm Caribbean sun, the unknown had opened its door, and Spain had stepped through. Chapter 3. First Contact, First Empire. The water was warm, clear, and shallow when the wooden hull of the Santa Maria brushed against the sands of the New World. The first light of morning slipped over the horizon, casting a golden hue on palm, trees, and quiet beaches. The air smelled of salt, life, and untouched mystery. It was October 12th, 1492, and Columbus had found land, though he believed he had reached islands near Asia. In truth, he had stepped into a different world entirely. He called the land San Salvador. The people who greeted him called it home. They were the Tino, gentle, curious, and open-hearted. Their skin was painted by sun and wind, their ways shaped by nature and tradition. They came forward not with fear, but with gifts. Their welcome was soft, like the waves that washed the shore. But behind their smiles, a question lingered. Who were these strange men who came from the sea? Columbus saw in them simplicity, beauty, and the mark of innocence. But more than that, he saw gold. The Tino wore small ornaments of it, not as treasure, but as decoration. To Columbus, it was a sign. He asked where the gold came from. He measured their responses. He believed he had found the edge of the Indies, and he wrote to the crown with wonder in his voice. He described lands of beauty, people without weapons, and opportunities beyond imagination. But he also misread what he saw. Where the Tino saw community, he saw weakness. Where they offered friendship, he imagined submission. He believed they would be easy to convert, easy to govern, easy to mold into servants of empire. To the Tino, the visitors were spirits at first, possibly divine, but the shine of armor soon gave way to hunger, and the glint in the stranger's eyes turned from curiosity to control. This moment, this brief, sacred crossing of two worlds, would be the beginning of something far larger than either side could know. Columbus walked among coconut trees, believing he had discovered paradise. But what he truly found was the gate to centuries of change, most of it painful. A shipwrecked colony. Not long after the first encounter, tragedy shifted the course of the voyage. On Christmas Eve, the Santa Maria ran aground off the coast of present-day Haiti. The ship, strong enough to cross the Atlantic, could not survive the reefs of this new land. With limited space on the two remaining ships, Columbus faced a difficult decision. He would leave behind a small group of men, 39 in all, alongside local allies, in a place he called La Navidad, or the Nativity. This settlement was not part of some great plan. It was born out of necessity, crafted quickly from the wreckage of the ship. The men left behind were instructed to keep peace, to treat the Tino with respect, and to wait. But Columbus had little idea of what would unfold after he sailed away. He believed he had planted the seed of Spain's presence. But seeds need more than hope. They need care. The Tino offered shelter and food. They were generous. But they had their own rules, their own customs, and their own dignity. The Spanish, once Columbus was gone, began to stray. Power, without supervision, turned greedy. Conflict grew where cooperation was once possible. And when Columbus returned nearly a year later, La Navidad was no more. The colony had been destroyed, the men killed. The reasons remain debated. Some say the Spanish mistreated their hosts. Others believe old rivalries between Tino chiefs played a role. But whatever the truth, the outcome was clear. First contact had ended in blood. This failure did not end the dream of empire. Instead, it sharpened it. Columbus now knew that to control the New World, Spain would need more than faith and flags. It would need settlers, soldiers, supplies, and systems of rule. The age of simple discovery had ended. The age of permanent presence had begun. Return to applause. Back in Spain, Columbus was not a failed leader. He was a hero. He arrived in the spring of 1493, bringing with him exotic parrots, golden trinkets, native captives, and tales that seemed to come from the edge of heaven. His words stirred the court. He spoke of fertile lands, gentle peoples, and untold wealth. He promised more, always more. Ferdinand and Isabella, victorious after Granada and newly confident in their unified crown, received him with pride. His success came at the perfect time. Spain, now looking outward, was ready for a new chapter, and Columbus had opened it. His voyage was seen not only as a maritime success, but as a spiritual one. He had brought back souls to be converted, lands to be claimed, and a vision of Christian empire that seemed destined by God. Soon, letters spread across Europe. The Pope himself took notice. In 1493, the papal bull Inter Caetera granted Spain the right to claim newly discovered lands west of a certain line in the Atlantic. Portugal, already strong in its own explorations, objected. And by 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal, an imaginary line drawn across oceans neither truly understood. Spain's path had changed. It was no longer a land locked in crusades. It was now a nation with overseas rights, divine favor, and royal will behind it. Columbus's return had not just impressed the monarchs, it had awakened their ambition. They began to gather ships, men, and money for another voyage, not of one explorer, but of a fleet. Not to visit, but to stay. The dream of empire had moved from idea to action, and Columbus, whether he knew it or not, had set into motion forces that would reshape continents. Second voyage, second thoughts. In the fall of 1493, Columbus set sail again. But this time, it was not a quiet journey. He led 17 ships, carrying over 1,000 men, sailors, soldiers, priests, craftsmen. This was no longer exploration, this was colonization. Spain had come not just to see the New World, but to own it. The fleet arrived in Hispaniola, only to find the ruins of La Navidad. Columbus was shocked, but not deterred. He ordered a new settlement, La Isabella, named for his queen. It was the first planned colony in the Americas, and it marked the beginning of Spain's foothold in the West. But the challenges were immediate. The soil was unfamiliar. Disease spread. Supplies ran low. Tensions with the Tino deepened. This paradise, once imagined as gentle and abundant, proved far more complex. The Spanish settlers had been promised wealth. Instead, they found hardship. Many grew angry. Others grew cruel. Efforts to control the Tino turned violent. Resistance met repression. And through it all, Columbus struggled to maintain order. His authority, earned at sea, did not easily extend to land. Complaints about his leadership began to rise. Even those once loyal began to question him. Still, the mission continued. New lands were explored. More ships returned to Spain, bearing gold and stories. But the tone had changed. This was no longer a voyage of wonder. It had become a machine, one that needed more resources, more control, and more obedience. Back in Spain, the crown began to send officials, not just to support Columbus, but to watch him. He had opened the door, but now others would begin to shape what lay beyond it. The age of one man's dream was ending. The age of empire had truly begun. In the soft winds over the Caribbean, the world had changed. What began as a journey into mystery now stirred the engines of conquest. And in the eyes of the Tino, those who had first smiled on the beach, new shadows had begun to fall. Chapter 4: The Encommenda and the Cross. In the golden morning light of the Caribbean, the land shimmered with promise. Palms swayed in the breeze. Birds cried over turquoise bays. And on the shores of islands like Hispaniola, ships arrived one after another, carrying men who believed they had found the edge of paradise. But their visions were divided. Some came carrying crosses, others carried swords, and the line between them was not always clear. The missionaries came with robes and rosaries, their eyes fixed on salvation. They saw the Tino as souls to be, saved, gentle, intelligent, and open to faith. To them, this was a sacred mission, not of conquest, but of conversion. They baptized, they preached, and they taught the gospel. Their message was peace, mercy, and eternal life. In their hearts, they believed they were doing good. But alongside them came conquistadors and settlers, whose dreams were shaped by a different calling. These men came not to spread the word, but to seek gold. They saw in the islands not a flock, but a resource. They measured the world in weight, not wonder. Their prayers were brief, their swords long. For them, the land was opportunity, and its people, once admired, became labor. At first, these two visions, salvation and wealth, tried to coexist, but the contradiction grew heavy. How could one love a people and still exploit them? How could the same hand offer a blessing and a chain? The tension between missionaries and soldiers, between chapel and colony, would only grow. And through it all, the Tino stood between two worlds, welcomed with hymns, yet crushed by hunger. The Spanish crown encouraged both faith and order. They sent more friars, more officials, more settlers. The empire was still new, still shaping its identity, but already a deep unease had begun to stir. The dream of a Christian kingdom across the sea was being clouded by greed, and every prayer that rose from the chapel echoed against the walls of injustice. The Indians' burden. With every passing month, the colonies grew. New ships arrived, bringing men eager for land, status, and a share in the empire's riches. But gold was scarce, and farming under the tropical sun was grueling. To make this new world work, the Spanish turned to labor, and they turned to the native people to supply it. Thus was born the Anchamandanda System. On paper, it was meant to be a mutual agreement. A Spanish settler would be granted a group of native people. In exchange for their labor, he was to protect them, teach them Spanish ways, and guide them in Christian faith. But in practice, it became something else. Something harder, something crueler. The Tino were now required to farm, mine, and billed for their encomendero. They were taxed in sweat, in blood, in silence. The system resembled the old feudalism of Europe, but without the protections or traditions. The natives had no real rights. They were not slaves by name, but the pain was the same. Women were separated from families. Children worked in fields. Men dug deep into the earth for traces of gold that rarely appeared. Hunger spread as fields, once used for community, were turned into profits. Disease, brought unknowingly by the Spanish, tore through the villages. Entire populations withered in a matter of years. The Encomienda was not born out of hatred. It was born from need, from ambition, from the logic of empire. But it cut deep. What had begun as first contact now hardened into structure. The Spanish built towns, raised churches, and held masses. But behind the sound of bells and hymns was the steady beat of forced labor. Some encomenderos were kind, many were not. And even those with good intentions found themselves trapped in a system that rewarded exploitation. The empire was young, and already its heart was divided. Voices in the wilderness. Not all Spaniards accepted this burden without question. Among the friars and missionaries, a new voice began to rise. A quiet protest at first, but one that would echo across centuries. His name was Bartolomé de las Casas. He came to the New World like many others, full of belief, ambition, and a sense of purpose. At first, he accepted the encomienda, owning native laborers like his peers. But something shifted. He watched the suffering. He heard the silence of those who could not speak for themselves. And one day, he could no longer stay quiet. Las Casas returned to Spain and spoke to kings and councils. He wrote letters, delivered sermons, and challenged the soul of the empire. He called the encomienda what it was, a system of cruelty. He said the natives were not inferior, not heathens, not tools for wealth, but children of God. And he asked, what does it mean to save a soul while destroying a body? At first, he was dismissed. Many saw him as idealistic, even dangerous. But over time, his message gained weight. Laws were written to protect the natives. Debates filled courtrooms and chapels. The empire began to argue with itself, faith on one side, force on the other. Las Casas did not end the system, but he began something powerful. He planted the first seeds of conscience. And those seeds, watered by time and pain, would grow into questions that still echo today. Can empire be just? Can faith survive ambition? Can goodness live inside power? In a world filled with silence, Las Casas became a voice. And though the wilderness was vast, he spoke. Columbus overwhelmed. At the center of it all stood Columbus. Once a mariner with a dream, he now wore a crown of command. The Spanish monarchs had named him governor of the new lands. But governing was not sailing, and paradise, once touched, proved difficult to hold. In Hispaniola, the colony struggled. The settlers were restless. They wanted gold, not farms. They wanted slaves, not sermons. Columbus tried to keep order, but his methods grew harsh. He punished rebellion, seized property, and made enemies, not just among the Tino, but among his own men. Reports of cruelty reached Spain. Letters accused Columbus of favoritism, of violence, of failed leadership. He had discovered the lands, yes, but could he rule them? That question began to haunt his legacy. The Spanish crown, once patient, began to waver. They sent inspectors, they sent replacements, and eventually, they sent chains. Columbus was arrested, returned to Spain in disgrace and stripped of much of his authority. He would make one final voyage, searching for new lands, chasing a dream that had once felt so real. But he never found the riches he promised, never returned to power, never became the ruler he imagined. Columbus died in 1506, old and forgotten by many, still believing he had reached Asia. He did not know the true size of the world he helped open. He did not see the empire rise, but he had lit the spark, and others would carry the flame. The new world had changed him. It had changed Spain. It had changed the Tino, and it would go on changing the world itself. But already, the weight of empire pressed heavy, and already, the cross and the crown walked paths that were no longer the same. Chapter 5. Beyond the islands, into the mainland. The sun still rose over the Caribbean with the same golden calm as it had years before, but the islands themselves had changed. The soil was tired. The rivers no longer whispered of wonder, and the native populations, once thriving, had thinned beneath the weight of labor, disease, and despair. Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico had all felt the touch of Spanish conquest, and already their bounty was fading. Gold became harder to find. Resistance spread in hushed voices. The dream of endless riches began to dim, but the hunger did not. And so, eyes turned west, toward the continent, toward new lands still hidden beyond the horizon. The conquistadors, restless and driven, believed the mainland would be different, larger, richer, and perhaps untouched by failure. But they brought with them the same blueprints drawn in the early days of Hispaniola. Enslave the locals, convert them to Christianity, and strip the land of its treasures. What had started as cautious settlement became a pattern, repeated with steady hands. The Spanish built outposts, raised wooden crosses, and planted royal flags in foreign soil. They came with the gospel in one hand and a sword in the other. The promises of salvation were real, but so were the chains. Wherever they landed, they asked the same questions. Who leads here? Where is the gold? What God do you worship? Each new region, from the coasts of Central America to the forested edges of South America, faced the same storm. Local leaders were captured or killed. Villages were burned or taken. Cultures were misunderstood and often destroyed. But still, the push westward continued. The islands had been the beginning. The real conquest, the Spaniards believed, was waiting just beyond the shoreline. The founding of Darion. It was in the thick, steamy jungles of what is now Panama that a small band of Spaniards carved out the first permanent European colony on mainland America. They called it Darion. The land was lush and difficult. Rivers ran through dense forests. Humidity clung to skin like a second layer. And yet, for Vasco Núñez de Balboa, this was the place to begin again. Balboa was not a noble by birth. He had once tried his luck farming on Hispaniola, but debts chased him to the edge of ruin. With little more than his name and a restless spirit, he hid himself aboard a ship bound for the mainland. When the ship made landfall, Balboa stepped ashore not as a passenger, but as a man with purpose. At first, his presence was unwanted. The colony's leadership already had plans. But Balboa had something stronger than title. He had charisma, skill, and determination. When the fledgling colony of Santa Maria la Antigua del Darién struggled to survive, it was Balboa who organized the food supply, soothed native tensions, and defended against uprisings. Slowly, he rose in stature. The men began to follow him, and soon, so did the crown. Darion was no paradise. It was a place of mud, mosquitoes, and menace. But it endured. It became the first foothold of Spanish power on the American mainland. From this small settlement, trade would begin, expeditions would launch, and empires would stir. Balboa governed with a mix of force and diplomacy. He understood that native alliances mattered, even if he did not fully understand their cultures. He made deals with local tribes, learned from their movements, and used their knowledge to go further inland. He listened when others imposed, and because of that, he would be the one to discover something Spain had long sought but never seen. The glimpse of the Pacific. It began as a rumor, a whisper carried through jungle paths by native allies. There was a great sea, they said, beyond. The mountains. Not a river, not a lake, but a vast body of water that stretched farther than eyes could see. Balboa, always thinking of routes to Asia, believed this could be the passage the Spanish had dreamed of, a gateway to the riches of the East. So in 1513, he led a small group across the Isthmus of Panama. The journey was brutal. They climbed hills slick with rain. They crossed rivers swollen by storms. The jungle pressed in around them, thick and alive. But day by day, step by step, they moved forward. Native guides led the way. Some tribes welcomed them. Others fought to defend their lands. Balboa's group pressed on, knowing that something greater lay ahead. On September 25th, they reached the peak of a ridge. From there, Balboa saw it, a calm, endless ocean stretching to the horizon. The South Sea, he called it. Later, it would be known as the Pacific. The moment was quiet, but its meaning was vast. Spain had reached another ocean. The world, once thought small and enclosed, now stretched wider than ever imagined. Balboa waded into the waters with his sword raised and claimed the ocean and all lands touching it for the Spanish crown. It was a ceremonial act, more symbolic than real, but it meant everything to the empire. The dream of reaching Asia by sailing west, once only theory, felt possible again. This glimpse of the Pacific reawakened Spain's global ambition. They had not yet found China, but they had found the sea that led there. New maps would be drawn, new voyages planned. The hunger of the empire would now spread in two directions, across both the Atlantic and Pacific. Power games and betrayals. Though Balboa had changed the course of Spanish exploration, he had also stepped into the shadows of imperial politics. His rise had been sudden, and not all welcomed it. Enemies grew in quiet corners. Men who envied his position, questioned his authority, or simply sought his fall. In Spain, power was never just about discovery. It was about control. And back in the Caribbean, the governor of Hispaniola, Pedro Arias d'Avila, known as Pedrarias, was given authority over the region. He was older, more connected, and deeply suspicious of Balboa. When he arrived in Darion in 1514, with a large force and fresh orders, tensions ignited. Balboa tried to work with Pedrarias. He married the governor's daughter by arrangement, hoping to build trust. He remained focused on new explorations, even planning to build ships to sail the Pacific. But his success had made him a threat. Rumors spread, letters were written, and in 1519, Balboa was arrested under charges of treason and plotting to form a separate kingdom. There was no fair trial, only fear, envy, and haste. Balboa, once the man who had opened Spain's eyes to the Pacific, was publicly beheaded in the Plaza of Acla. His life ended not in battle, but in betrayal. A reminder that in empire, discovery was only half the story. The other half was power, and power did not forgive ambition easily. His death sent a chill through the colonies. It was a warning. Even the boldest could fall. Even heroes could be replaced. Spain would remember his name, but not protect his legacy. The Pacific he had seen would soon be filled with Spanish ships. The world he helped expand would grow without him. The mainland had been opened. The conquest had begun. But in that opening, the cost had already been written, in sweat, in silence, and in the blood of those too early to know how deep the empire's hunger would run. Chapter 6. Magellan's Circle. Ferdinand Magellan was born into a world already shaped by winds, sails, and rivalries. Portugal, his homeland, had risen quickly as a maritime power. The sea was not a boundary, it was a path. From Lisbon, Portuguese ships had rounded Africa, reached India, and traded with the East. But for Magellan, the sea was something more than trade. It was a question, a calling. As a young man, he joined naval campaigns, sailing east across the long coastlines of Africa and into the shimmering waters of the Indian Ocean. He fought in wars, learned the stars, and studied the wind. Yet when he returned to Lisbon, hoping to be sent again, this time with a fleet of his own, the Portuguese court dismissed him. They saw him as ambitious, perhaps arrogant. He asked for too much, they said. He was loyal to Portugal, but Portugal was not loyal to him, and so Magellan did the unthinkable. He turned away from the kingdom of his birth and brought his dream to Spain, the rival throne across the Western Sea. Spain, hungry to compete with Portugal's eastern trade routes, listened. Magellan proposed that Asia could be reached by sailing west, not around Africa, but through the lands recently discovered in the Americas. He believed the world could be circled, though no one had done it yet. He believed there was a hidden passage beneath South America. Spain was intrigued, not because they fully trusted him, but because they were desperate to break Portugal's grip on the spice trade. In 1519, Magellan was granted 5 ships and a crew of over 200 men. He was given a royal contract, a flag to sail under, and a monumental task. They left from Seville, gliding down the Guadalquivir River, past olive groves and stone villages, into the open Atlantic. Few understood how far they would go. Fewer still would live to see the end. The fleet carried more than supplies and sails. It carried the hopes of an empire, and it carried the burden of a single man's determination to reach the far side of the world, the Strait of Ghosts. The early weeks were smooth. The ships followed the familiar lines down the coast of Africa, then crossed westward, reaching the lush shores of Brazil. They anchored in gentle harbors and gathered fresh water. Spirits were high, but the farther south they sailed, the less familiar the world became. They followed the long curve of the South American coastline, tracing its edge like a fingertip across a globe. But the coast was long, colder than expected, and the days grew, shorter as the ships neared the southernmost reaches of the continent. By the time they reached Patagonia, the wind bit hard, the sun grew weak. The landscape turned to stone and scrub, harsh and desolate. Food supplies dwindled. Relations among the men began to strain. Rumors of mutiny spread like smoke. 3 of the 5 captains rose up against Magellan. They wanted to turn back. They said the voyage was cursed, that there was no passage, that they had been led into the jaws of death. But Magellan did not yield. He arrested 1 captain, executed another, sent the 3rd home in chains. His leadership, once questioned, was now enforced by fear and conviction. And then, at last, in October 1520, they found it, a narrow, twisting waterway hidden between cliffs, sheltered by shadows, carved by ice and time. The land closed around them, and the sea whispered a different name. They had discovered what Magellan had always believed existed, a secret strait. The journey through it took over a month. The waters were rough, the passages narrow. Mountains loomed over the ships. Fires burned on the hillsides, lit by unseen peoples. The sailors called it the Strait of Ghosts, for they felt they were being watched, not by men, but by the land itself. One ship, too afraid to continue, deserted and sailed back to Spain. The others pushed on and finally emerged into a sea unlike any they had known. The sky stretched vast, the waves rolled gently, and there was silence. Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. It was not truly peaceful, but in that moment, it felt like calm after a long storm. He had done what none before him had. He had found a passage to the other side of the world. Marta in the Philippines. The Pacific crossing would not be so forgiving. Though the sea was calm, the journey was cruel. They sailed for more than 3 months without seeing land. The food spoiled. Rats became meals. Leather was boiled and chewed. Scurvy hollowed the men from within. Dozens died. The ocean offered nothing but salt and sun. The peace of the Pacific was slow and deadly. Finally, in March 1521, land broke the horizon. Palms rose from distant beaches. The ships, near collapse, found refuge among the islands of what would become the Philippines. At first, it seemed like salvation. The locals were curious, kind, willing to trade. Magellan, still weak but determined, made peace with several island leaders. He offered gifts, spoke of God, and baptized many into Christianity. But his mission shifted. He began to believe he was called not only to explore, but to convert, to conquer with the word as much as the sword. On the island of Mactan, a local chief named Lapu-Lapu refused to kneel. He would not submit. And Magellan, believing his strength would win the day, led a small force ashore. The battle was quick and brutal. The Spaniards, burdened by armor and unfamiliar ground, were overwhelmed. Magellan was struck down, stabbed, speared, and left in the surf. He died not at sea, but on a foreign shore, trying to bring belief by force. His body was never recovered. His dream ended where ambition turned to overreach. Yet even in death, his voyage lived on. The remaining crew, stunned and leaderless, carried his vision forward. They sailed west again, toward the Spice Islands, toward survival, toward home. Return of the survivors. Only 2 ships remained, Trinidad and Victoria. They reached the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and finally achieved the mission's goal. They loaded the holds with cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon. Enough spice to pay for the voyage, 100 times over, but then came more hardship. The Trinidad was too damaged to continue. She tried to return eastward but was captured by the Portuguese. Only the Victoria was left. Under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, the Victoria sailed westward still, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and northward along the coast of Africa. The journey was long, haunted by disease, storms, and loss. By the time the ship reached Spain in September 1522, only 18 men remained. They had sailed 42,000 miles. They had crossed 3 oceans. They had touched shores in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And they had proven what many had only guessed. The Earth was round, vast, and connected by water. Magellan had not lived to see it. But the voyage he began had wrapped around the world. Spain now knew its power could stretch farther than maps had ever dared. The empire had touched the edge of the globe, and the story of mankind had shifted. No longer would the world be imagined in halves. Now it was one. From a Portuguese rebel's rejection came a global awakening. From desperation came the most profound voyage of all time. And though the Victoria limped into port, her sails torn, her men skeletal, her purpose had endured. She carried not just spice, but certainty. The world had been circled, and Spain stood ready to claim it. Chapter 7. The Fall of Tenochtitlan. The journey began not with the clash of swords, but with shimmering temptation and whispered promises. When Hernán Cortés first stepped onto the shores of what is now Mexico in 1519, he was not yet the conqueror of empires. He was a Spaniard with ambition, a handful of men, and an insatiable hunger for glory. The winds of the Caribbean had carried rumors, tales of gold, cities built of jade, and rulers adorned in feathers and turquoise. And it was gold that first bridged the divide between civilizations. Messengers from the Aztec Empire brought gifts to the strangers: bracelets, discs, ornaments of shining metal. The Spanish, unknowing of its cultural meaning, saw only treasure. But gold was not the greatest prize Cortés would receive. Among the early contacts were two invaluable gifts: interpreters. The first was a Spanish castaway named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had lived among the Maya and learned their tongue. The second was a woman named Malintzin, known to the Spanish as La Malinche. She was more than a translator, she was a key. Fluent in both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya, she stood at the center of Cortés's web of influence. Through her, words passed from tongue to tongue, but so did ideas, threats, and dreams of dominance. Through Malintzin, Cortés began to read the soul of the land he had entered. He saw an empire vast and glorious, but splintered. Cities that paid tribute to the Aztecs did so under duress. Some feared Tenochtitlan, others hated it. Beneath the surface, loyalty wavered. Cortés, the outsider, recognized a pattern older than empires: divide and conquer. And so, with words as his first weapons, he sowed doubt, flattered enemies, and made himself not a foreign invader, but a liberator to the oppressed. He held mass in the open, let horses gallop before astonished eyes, and displayed steel armor gleaming in the sun. Where awe took root, resistance began to bend. And where tribute once flowed to Tenochtitlan, now it whispered toward the Spanish. In gold and language, in gesture and gaze, Cortés was laying foundations, not for diplomacy, but for domination. Tlaxcala, the unlikely alliance. At the edge of the Aztec world lay Tlaxcala, a fierce and independent confederation of city-states. For generations, the Tlaxcalans had fought bitterly against the Aztecs and resisted all attempts at conquest. They were warriors to the bone, stubborn, proud, and scarred by war. When Cortés approached, he was met not with welcome, but with blades. The Tlaxcalans ambushed his forces, hoping to wipe them from the land before they could pose a threat. For days, the battles were brutal and unrelenting. Spanish guns thundered, but Tlaxcalan warriors charged again and again. The hills ran red, and the outcome seemed uncertain. But Cortés did not seek only victory. He sought understanding. He paused the fighting and sent envoys, gifts, and words of respect. Slowly, the Tlaxcalans reconsidered. These Spaniards, after all, hated the Aztecs. They had powerful weapons. They had horses, beasts the Tlaxcalans had never seen. Most of all, they had ambition. The enemy of my enemy, they thought, could could be a useful friend. And so, history turned. Tlaxcala opened its gates, and the once bloodied fields became grounds of alliance. Cortés and his men were welcomed into homes, given food, and healed of wounds. He spoke of liberation from Aztec tyranny, of a future in which Tlaxcala would rise alongside Spain. Whether out of hope, revenge, or strategy, the Tlaxcalans agreed. Thousands of their warriors joined Cortés's march. They knew the terrain, the roads, the weaknesses of the Aztec heart. This alliance would prove crucial. It turned the Spanish from a few hundred into a formidable army. It gave them knowledge, numbers, and a cause. But it also revealed a deep truth. The Aztec Empire, though mighty, was hated by many. And in that hate, Cortés found his fuel. With banners lifted and drums sounding, he marched not as an outsider, but as the leader of a rebellion. Tlaxcala had not merely joined Spain, they had ignited the fall of an empire. Into the lake city. When at last the Spanish and their allies approached Tenochtitlan, it was as though they had stepped into a dream. The city rose from the heart of Lake Texcoco, its shimmering waters reflecting temples and towers. Long causeways stretched across the water like veins of stone. Canoes glided silently past flower gardens that floated on the lake. Wide boulevards, clean and orderly, led to marketplaces alive with color and sound. The city was larger than any in Spain, home to perhaps 250,000 souls. It was, to the Spanish eye, a miracle of civilization. Yet beneath its beauty lay something darker. In the towering temples, blood had stained the stone. Human. Sacrifice was not an aberration, it was the heartbeat of Aztec religion. The gods, it was believed, demanded nourishment in blood, and the empire obeyed. Prisoners were taken in battle, not to be held, but to be offered. And when the drums of sacrifice pounded, the city echoed with cries not only of devotion, but of death. Cortés was both horrified and intrigued. He moved carefully, knowing that brute force could not yet be used. Montezuma II, the emperor, welcomed him into the city. Whether out of hospitality, diplomacy, or superstition, the ruler treated Cortés with honor. The Spaniards were given quarters in the palace, gifts were exchanged, and for a time, peace held. But it was a peace of mirrors, shimmering, fragile, and deceptive. Cortés knew he could not hold the city forever through politeness, and so he acted. In a swift and calculated move, he took Montezuma hostage. The emperor became a prisoner in his own palace, still robed in gold, still seated on his throne, but watched and silenced. The Spanish declared their presence holy, their faith superior. They desecrated temples, toppled idols, and demanded tribute. The people of Tenochtitlan grew restless. Their emperor, once divine, now seemed weak. Resentment gathered like a storm on the lake, and all the while, Cortés played his final game, waiting, watching, preparing for the inevitable break. The night of sorrows. It came like thunder in the night. Word reached the city that Cortés had temporarily left to face a rival Spanish force on the coast. In his absence, the Spanish captain left behind, Pedro de Alvarado, committed a massacre. During a sacred festival, while dancers celebrated in rhythm and color, Spanish swords struck, priests were cut down, children and elders fell. The temple grounds became a killing floor. When Cortés returned, the damage had been done. The city had turned. The people, once curious or passive, now seethed with rage. Tenochtitlan was no longer a place of negotiation. It was a trap. The Spanish barricaded themselves in the palace, surrounded and outnumbered. The streets grew hostile, stones flew, food ran short. And then Montezuma himself died, struck either by his own people or by the Spanish. The divine link was broken. The rebellion ignited. On a rainy June night in 1520, the Spanish made their escape. With gold hidden beneath their cloaks and weapons in hand, they crept out of the palace and onto the causeways. But the city knew. Warriors emerged from the shadows. Canoes filled the waters. Arrows and spears rained down. The narrow paths became death traps. Many Spanish soldiers drowned, dragged down by the weight of their stolen gold. Horses fell into the lake. Cannons were abandoned. Tlaxcalan allies died by the hundreds. It was chaos, a nightmare beneath the thunderclouds. Cortés survived, but barely. He wept on the far bank of the lake, under the grey dawn. That moment became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. For the first time, the Spanish had tasted the wrath of the empire they sought to destroy. But Cortés did not retreat in defeat. He retreated to plan. He rebuilt his forces, drew more allies, and returned with vengeance. In time, he would return to Tenochtitlan, not as a guest, but as its destroyer. The siege that followed would bring starvation, plague, and fire. And in August 1521, after months of battle, the city of water and stone finally fell. The temples were shattered. The canals ran red. And the Aztec Empire, so vast, so radiant, was no more. In its place rose New Spain. But behind its walls, the echoes of Tenochtitlan would never truly fade. Chapter 8. The Inca Fall, the Gold of the Sun. High above the valleys of South America, where clouds brush the mountain peaks and the air grows thin with silence, the Inca Empire once ruled as a kingdom of the sun. From the sacred city of Cusco, nestled deep within the Andes, the Sapa Inca, the emperor, governed a realm of staggering beauty and order. Roads carved from stone crisscrossed mountains and ravines, linking villages, temples, and storehouses across a land so vast it touched the coasts, the deserts, and the jungles beyond. Runners moved swiftly along these roads, carrying messages wrapped in knots of colored thread. Quipu, the language of numbers and memory. But the Inca Empire was more than roads and stone. It was an idea, shaped by harmony and control. The people farmed the high terraces, planting maize and potatoes in soil nourished by glacier-fed streams. Llamas moved in long caravans through the valleys, and the land gave back what the people offered it, with gratitude, but also with demand. In return for labor and loyalty, the state fed its people. From the massive storehouses came grain, tools, and woven cloth in times of hardship. There was no need for coin. The empire was built on reciprocity, on giving, receiving, and believing that all things came from Inti, the sun god. And at the center of it all stood the Sapa Inca, son of the sun, dressed in garments threaded with gold and crowned in feathers. His word was law, his steps sacred. When he spoke, it was said even the rivers paused to listen. Beneath him, priests watched the stars, nobles governed the provinces, and builders shaped mountains into cities. From Machu Picchu's mist-covered heights to the plazas of Cusco, the Inca world pulsed with spiritual rhythm and careful design. Yet even in this kingdom of clouds, far from the oceans that carried foreign sails, danger was rising. Not from storms, not from famine, but from ambition, its own, and that of men soon to arrive from a world the Inca could not have imagined. A civil war of shadows. When the Spanish first set foot in the lands of the Inca, they did not find a united empire. They found a kingdom, wounded from within. Just years before their arrival, a terrible sickness, likely smallpox, brought by earlier Spanish contact, had reached the Andes ahead of them. It moved silently through villages and across mountains, leaving thousands dead, including the Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir. With no clear succession, the empire cracked in two. Two brothers rose to claim the throne: Huáscar, who ruled from the capital of Cusco, and Atahualpa, who controlled the northern strongholds near Quito. What followed was a civil war, a bitter struggle of betrayal, battles, and shifting loyalties. Armies marched across the Andes, burning towns and seizing fortresses. Warriors who once stood side by side turned against one another. For the Inca people, it was a time of sorrow. Communities were torn apart. Crops withered in fields as men were called to war. Temples stood silent. And though Atahualpa eventually triumphed, defeating Huáscar and capturing him, the empire that remained was not the same. Its strength was hollowed, its people exhausted. The golden order of the past had dimmed. It was into this moment of weakness and confusion that Francisco Pizarro entered. Like Cortés before him, he came not with great numbers, but with sharp eyes and sharper plans. He brought fewer than 200 men, steel-clad, cross-bearing, hungry, but he had something even more powerful than weapons: timing. To the Inca, Pizarro's arrival may have seemed like an omen. Pale-skinned, bearded strangers riding animals no Andean had ever seen. Their arrival stirred whispers. Were they gods? Were they messengers of the unknown? In a land still echoing with civil war and death, it was hard to say. But one thing was clear: these visitors had come for more than friendship. The Room of Gold, Atahualpa, now the undisputed ruler of the Inca, agreed to meet Pizarro near the town of Cajamarca. Confident in his divine status, he brought no army, only a royal retinue. The emperor sat on a golden litter, carried by servants, surrounded by dancers and musicians. He was not afraid. He believed himself untouchable, blessed by the sun and guarded by destiny. But Pizarro had studied Cortés's conquest of the Aztecs. He knew the power of surprise. As Atahualpa entered the city square, Spanish cannons roared. Soldiers emerged from hiding, swords drawn. Chaos exploded. The Inca guards were cut down. Atahualpa was seized. The God King, son of the sun, was taken alive. The shock was seismic. The Inca army, vast and strong, was left leaderless. Messengers ran through the highlands. Temples held prayers. But nothing could change what had occurred. The unthinkable had happened. The sun had been captured by shadows. Pizarro knew what he held. Atahualpa's life was a coin he could spend slowly. The Spanish demanded a ransom, one unlike anything the world had seen. A single room, they said, filled to the height of a man with gold. Two more, filled with silver. And the Inca answered. From every corner of the empire, golden artifacts were brought. Statues, jewelry, ceremonial objects. Temples were stripped. Sun discs were torn from walls. The wealth of centuries was melted, stacked, and recorded. But gold was never the goal. It was power, control. Once the room was full, once the Spanish held riches beyond imagination, they killed Atahualpa, strangled, silent. The empire had paid its price, but the bargain was never fair. The death of the emperor broke something sacred. The sun no longer spoke. The chain that linked earth and sky had been shattered. Though puppet, rulers would be placed on the throne, the Inca world would never recover. The heart of the empire had been stolen, one golden room at a time. march to the sacred capital. With Atahualpa gone and the ransom melted into bars, Pizarro moved south. He marched through valleys where farmers once sang to the earth and climbed, paths lined with carved stones. His forces were not large, but resistance had been broken. Cities surrendered. Some welcomed the Spanish, hoping to avoid the fate of Cajamarca. Others resisted and fell. When Pizarro reached Cusco, the sacred capital of the Inca, he found a city of beauty and sorrow. Temples rose from finely cut stone. The streets aligned with stars. Gold had once covered its walls, gleaming like the sun at dawn. But now, much of that gold was gone. The Spanish looted what remained. Churches would rise where temples had stood. The empire's past would be paved over, but never forgotten. Pizarro installed Manco Inca, a young noble, as a puppet ruler. The Spanish called it peace. But beneath the surface, the Andes watched and waited. Manco Inca would soon rebel. Others would follow. Though the empire was broken, its spirit lingered, in mountain shrines, in whispered prayers, in the steady planting of seeds. The Spanish believed they had conquered, but the land remembered, the people remembered, and though the sun seemed distant, it still rose, day after day, over the ruins of Cusco, over the shattered temples, over the quiet strength of a world that would not vanish. Chapter 9. The Jungle King and the Castilian Court. The highlands of Peru once echoed with the chants of sun worship and the footfall of empire. But after the fall of the Inca, those echoes changed. Gold, not gods, became the loudest voice. At the heart of this shifting world stood two men, Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, brothers not by blood, but by ambition and conquest. They had stood together in battle. They had watched Atahualpa's empire crumble beneath their feet. But with victory came hunger. With gold came jealousy. And with cities came questions. Who would rule what? At first, they shared. Pizarro claimed the northern lands, founding Lima as his stronghold. Almagro looked south, setting his sights on Chile, a region spoken of in myths, but cruel in truth. He ventured into its mountains and deserts, seeking another empire, another prize. But he found no gold, only hardship and frost. When he returned to Peru, weary and empty-handed, he found the best lands already carved up and claimed. His fury was quiet but deep. Pizarro, now governor, had grown used to command. His brothers held power. His enemies grew silent. But Almagro was not content to fade. He rallied allies, men who felt wronged, passed over, or forgotten. Tensions hardened into lines. Once brothers in arms now watched each other across drawn swords. In 1537, their conflict burst into violence. Almagro seized Cusco, claiming it as his by right. The city, still grieving its lost gods, became a pawn in a Spanish civil war. For the people of the Andes, the cruelty was familiar. Only now the conquerors fought each other. Pizarro sent his forces to reclaim what he had never intended to lose. Almagro was defeated, captured, and executed. His body hung in the square of a city he once dreamed to rule. What had begun as unity became ashes. And in those ashes, the Spanish crown saw something else: disorder. It was no longer conquest, it was chaos, and the King of Spain, seated far across the sea, began to stir from silence. The puppet empire of Manco. While the Spaniards quarreled among themselves, A spark lit quietly in the shadows. Manco Inca, the puppet emperor installed by Pizarro to placate the native population, had watched carefully. Young, intelligent, and descended from a long line of rulers, Manco played the role given to him. He smiled. He obeyed. But beneath the calm, a different current flowed. He had seen the temples defiled, the sun worship outlawed. His people turned into laborers for gold they could not keep. He had seen Atahualpa die, and Almagro and Pizarro tear each other apart. He had learned their weaknesses, not just in battle, but in pride, in greed, in their blindness to the land around them. In 1536, while Pizarro was distracted, Manco made his move. Under the guise of a peaceful pilgrimage, he slipped away from Cusco and vanished into the mountains. What followed was one of the greatest rebellions in the history of the Americas. Tens of thousands of Inca warriors rose up. Siege lines were drawn around Cusco. The Spanish, caught off guard, scrambled to defend what they thought they had already conquered. For months, Manco's forces battered the city. Fires raged. Supply lines were cut. Stone walls trembled with battle cries once more. Though the siege failed to fully retake Cusco, it marked a turning point. The puppet had become the resistance. Manco retreated into the jungle, not in defeat, but in strategy. There, deep in the Vilcabamba region, he founded a new Inca state, hidden by trees and shielded by mountains. This kingdom in exile would survive for decades. It was not large, it was not rich, but it was free. And in a world now ruled by crosses and steel, that freedom meant everything. Spanish chroniclers called it the Lost Inca State. But for the Andean people, it was a flicker of the old light, kept alive far from the gaze of the invader. And while the jungle swallowed the roads behind him, Manco's resistance whispered across generations. Blood on the marble floors. While the highlands of Peru throbbed with rebellion and revenge, the halls of Spain grew colder. The golden tide flowing from the New World had reached Castile's shores. But it did not bring only wealth. It brought questions. What had the conquistadors done in the name of the crown? What had they claimed? Who had they killed? And who truly ruled the Americas? Hernando Pizarro, brother of Francisco and one of the chief enforcers of Spanish control in Peru, returned to Spain to defend the family's honor. He came not with an army, but with arguments, scrolls of land deeds, names of loyalists, and tales of battles fought under banners of the king. But the crown was no longer asleep. Charles V had seen the dangers of unchecked power. He had heard the reports of massacres, betrayals, and treasure hoarded not for Spain, but for personal glory. Hernando was arrested and put on trial. The courtroom was not a battlefield. There were no horses or cannons, only paper, voices, and a growing unease about what the conquest had become. The very men who had taken empires now stood accused of cruelty, of theft, of defying the king himself. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was a shift. Spain was beginning to realize that it could not allow its distant subjects to act as independent lords. The age of wild conquest was ending. In its place, something colder was rising. Bureaucracy, rule by council, law from the Bay throne. Orders written not on battlefield flags, but on royal parchment. The marble floors of Madrid gleamed, but they too bore the weight of blood, drawn not by blades, but by ambition. And though Hernando spent years in prison, it was his brother's fate that would signal the true end of an era. The death of the conquistador. In 1541, Francisco Pizarro sat in his palace in Lima, a man surrounded by stone, silver, and silence. He was older now. The fire that once led him up mountain passes and into Inca temples had cooled into calculation. He had built a city where once there had been forest. He had killed an empire and raised another in its place. Yet even walls of stone could not keep out the consequences of power. Old enemies gathered in shadows. Supporters of Diego de Almagro, still bitter from his execution, plotted in the silence of side streets. On a June afternoon, they struck the key. Conspirators entered Pizarro's home with steel drawn. A servant cried out, but it was too late. Pizarro fought back with the force of a younger man. He killed one attacker and wounded another. But numbers won over strength. Blades pierced the conqueror of Peru. He staggered, bleeding, across his own chamber. Legend says he drew a cross in his own blood on the floor before falling, eyes open, mouth still trying to speak. The man who had faced emperors, who had seized cities, died not on the battlefield, but in a room of his own making. His death was not a national tragedy. It was a closing door. The age of men who conquered kingdoms for themselves was over. The Spanish crown, learning from the chaos, began to send viceroys, royal governors who answered not to gold or ego, but to Madrid. Cities were reorganized. Laws were written. The wild energy of conquest was smoothed into administration. The dreamers and the killers gave way to accountants and clerks. And in the jungle, the last Inca king still ruled in exile. Far from the cities of Spain, far from the crosses planted in temple ruins, they waited, silent, watching, unbroken. Chapter 10: Cities of Silver and the Price of Power. In the breathless heights of the Andes Mountains, where the air turns thin and the sky presses close to the earth, a strange silence once hung over the land. But that silence was broken in 1545, when a single moment of discovery changed not only a kingdom, but the fate of the world. Spanish colonists, led by tales whispered by indigenous guides, came upon a peak that seemed like a dream carved from rock. Cerro Rico, they called it, the rich hill, and what it held beneath its stony skin would become the lifeblood of an empire. The Spaniards did not just find a mine, they found a miracle wrapped in dust and danger. They struck the mountain with tools and found silver veins so thick they shimmered beneath torchlight. Word spread like wildfire across the New World and the Old, carried by sails and songs. Potosi, a barren, windswept place, exploded into a booming city. Within decades, it rivaled the great capitals of Europe. Homes, churches, fountains, theatres, all rose from silver's promise. But the wealth was not born freely. The mountain gave, but it also took. For each glittering bar sent across the sea, it demanded a price not written in ledgers. Potosi's beauty was stained with breathless labour and sleepless nights. The air was sharp and cold, and behind the polished doors of mansions there echoed the quiet cries of men trapped below. Meanwhile, in the deserts of northern Mexico, something stirred. In 1546, Zacatecas, another city of silver, was born. Tucked in dry, sunburnt lands, it mirrored Potosi in promise. The two cities became twins in a strange kind of birth, two hearts beating for the same crown. While Europe marveled at the flow of silver, the veins of the earth throbbed, and the burden was only beginning. The wheels of extraction. The wealth of Spain did not roll uphill on its own. It was carried, on backs bent by labor, by hands worn to the bone. The Spaniards created systems to keep the silver flowing, and at the center of it was the meter, a forced labor draft imposed on indigenous communities. From distant villages, Men were taken from their homes for weeks, months, sometimes years, to descend into the darkness beneath the mountains. Inside the mines, there was no time, no seasons, no sun. Miners worked in silence, breathing thick air laced with dust and laced with mercury. The deeper they dug, the more the earth resisted, closing in around them with crushing weight. Some dug until their hands bled, until the stone blurred into sleep. Others simply disappeared, buried in cave-ins or in records never kept. When the native population began to decline, the Spanish brought African slaves to fill the void. Ships crossed the Atlantic, filled with men torn from their lands. In Zacatecas and Potosi, black and brown bodies toiled side by side, brothers not by birth, but by burden. And it was not only the mines. Children were forced into mercury workshops, where silver was refined in poisonous pools. The mercury would enter their skin, sink into their lungs, and settle in their blood. Over time, memory faded, speech slowed, limbs trembled, but the silver came out bright. Above ground, the city sang of riches. Below, the mountain groaned with sorrow. The rhythm of extraction became constant. Bells rang to change shifts, carts creaked under heavy loads, and the pickaxes never stopped. For the empire to breathe, thousands had to suffocate. And yet, the mines never rested, because Spain could not afford them to. Coins of empire. Once melted and shaped, the silver did not stay where it was born. It traveled. From the mints of Potosi and Zacatecas, coins were struck with royal seals, the face of a king pressed into their surface, the weight of a continent behind them. These coins, reales, pesos, and pieces of 8, became the currency not just of Spain, but of the world. From the ports of Lima and Veracruz, great galleons carried silver across oceans, east across the Atlantic to Seville, west across the Pacific to Manila. These ships became the arteries of a new global economy, tying the world together with chains of precious metal. In return came silk from China, porcelain from Korea, spices from India, and guns from Europe. Silver was the thread, the ink, the blood. In Europe, silver bought wars and peace in equal measure. It paid for mercenaries and diplomats, for marriages between crowns and navies at sea. Palaces rose, cathedrals gleamed, and in the heart of Spain, the royal court grew grand beyond measure. But wealth is a fire. It warms and it burns. The more silver arrived, the more prices rose. Inflation swept through Spain like a tide. Bread cost more, land cost more, and slowly the treasure began to lose meaning. What was once a miracle became a problem too large to manage. Meanwhile, others took notice. Dutch merchants, English privateers, Ottoman traders all began chasing the silver tide. The oceans became battlegrounds. Galleons vanished beneath storms or into the mouths of pirates. Still, the empire pressed forward, because coins were not just money, they were power, and Spain had more of them than anyone else. A treasury too, heavy to hold empires rise on the promise of permanence. But silver, despite its gleam, is soft. The Spanish Empire stood like a tower built on coins. High, impressive, but dangerously heavy. With every year, the burden grew. The mines went deeper, the costs climbed higher, and the returns grew slower. The empire began to lean. Instead of building local industries, Spain bought everything from abroad. The fields at home were left to wither as ships brought wheat and wine from others. A nation that once fed the world now could not feed itself without silver. And when the silver slowed The cracks became too deep to ignore. Wars bled the treasury dry. Uprisings in the Netherlands, resistance in the Americas, endless conflict with England, all drained the coffers. Loans were taken, debts grew. The same silver that once dazzled now became a chain around Spain's neck. And then came the ships that never made it. Great fleets, lost to hurricanes or stolen by corsairs, vanished beneath the waves. Whole fortunes lay at the bottom of the sea. The empire wept, but it could not weep for long. New ships were built, new miners were taken. The cycle continued, because it had to. By the 1700s, the Spanish Empire had become too large, too scattered, too hungry to sustain. What had once seemed eternal now wavered. The palaces still stood, but the light inside had dimmed. The world Spain had built with silver began to slip away, coin by coin. And yet, high in the Andes, Cerro Rico remains. A mountain now hollowed, scarred by centuries of digging. It still draws miners, still offers glimmers, but it also stands as a monument to power, to greed, to dreams that cost too much. The silver cities once lit up the world, but in their light, many shadows were cast, and some of those shadows remain even now. Chapter 11. A galleon for the king, a cross for the soul. Across the wide and endless waters of the Pacific Ocean, something miraculous once sailed. Not just a ship, but a dream carved in wood and filled with silver. It was called the Manila Galleon. From the late 1500s until the early 1800s, this ship connected two worlds that before then had never truly touched, Asia and the Americas. From Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco in New Spain, the galleon traveled once a year, braving waters so vast that sailors often described the sea as a sky turned upside down. The journey was long and slow. For nearly 4 months, the ship, cut through the silence, guided only by the wind, the stars, and the prayers of those on board. It carried treasures, fine Chinese silks, porcelain that gleamed like water, ivory carvings, embroidered fans, and spices that once scented the palaces of emperors. The Pacific became Spain's royal road, an ocean highway of silver and silk. But this was more than trade. It was also transformation. Aboard the galleon, cultures met in the cargo hold. Languages mixed on the deck. Faiths brushed against one another in the quiet before dawn. The voyage was dangerous. Storms, disease, pirates. But it continued, year after year, for nearly 250 years. Each trip was a thread sewn into the fabric of global history. Each cargo list told the story of empires expanding, not only through war, but through the steady movement of goods and souls. Silver from the Americas paid for goods from China. The wealth dug from the mountains of Potosi and Zacatecas didn't stop at Madrid. It rippled outward, reaching as far as the Ming dynasty. In this way, the Manila Galleon was more than a ship. It was the bridge between continents, between the old world and the new, between the material and the spiritual. A floating city of whispers and wishes, riding the tides of empire. Manila, the pearl of the East. In the heart of the Pacific, nestled within the islands of the Philippines, Spain found its eastern jewel. Manila, founded by Spanish conquistadors in 1571, quickly became the capital of Spain's Asian empire. It stood at the crossroads of everything, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, between China and the New World. Here, on the banks of the Pasig River, East met West, and gold met incense. The city grew around a fortress called Intramuros, within the walls. Inside its stone boundaries lived the Spanish elite, priests and governors. Outside, life teemed with the sounds of Tagalog voices, Chinese merchants, Indian craftsmen, and native Filipinos carrying baskets of rice, fruit, and firewood. The markets overflowed with color: woven cloths from India, fans from Japan, peppers from Mexico, and fish fresh from the bay. Manila became the storehouse of an empire's dreams. It was here that Chinese merchants exchanged fine silk and jade for Spanish silver. The galleons waited in the harbor, sails furled like sleeping wings, ready to carry the East's treasures westward. But not all was calm. In the south of the Philippines, in Mindanao and Sulu, resistance stirred. Muslim sultanates refused Spanish rule. They fought back with boats called caracoas and warriors who knew the seas better than any map could show. Spain's grasp in the archipelago was never complete, and it was held together as much by faith and trade as by force. Still, Manila endured. Its walls withstood time, typhoons, and rebellion. The Spanish called it the Pearl of the Orient, not just for its riches, but for its role in something much deeper. From this city, not only goods flowed, but also beliefs. Missionaries fanned out across the islands, their paths shaped by rivers and prayers. Missionaries in the mist. While galleons carried silk and silver, another mission moved quietly beneath the sails. It walked on foot, climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and whispered in native tongues. The Catholic Church, with the support of the Spanish crown, sent missionaries, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, to spread Christianity across Asia and the Islands. These friars did not travel in gold-trimmed carriages. They walked barefoot through forests, slept under the stars, and relied on kindness from those they sought to convert. Carrying only a cross and a Bible, they entered villages hidden in mist and jungle. Many came with good intentions, others with rigid beliefs, but all came with a purpose: to change the soul of a land. They built missions on hilltops, often with the help of local labor. They planted not just crops, but cathedrals. They introduced Latin prayers, European hymns, and stories of saints whose lives seemed far from the heat and green of the islands. In return, they learned native languages, recorded local customs, and in some cases, protected the people from harsher colonial demands. Yet not every conversion was gentle. In some places, idols were burned, temples were torn down, ancient beliefs were labeled pagan, and centuries of tradition were lost too. The tide of the cross. The missionaries brought hope to some, confusion to others, and conflict to many, and still they pressed on. In the mountains of Luzon, among the rice terraces of Ifugao, along the coasts of Cebu and Palawan, they taught and baptized. Some died from disease, some were killed by those who saw them as threats. Others became part of the land itself, buried. In cemeteries beneath churches, they helped raise. The missions were not just buildings, they were moments frozen in time. A flicker of candlelight in a bamboo chapel, the echo of Latin in the jungle, the quiet tension between two worlds trying to live in one body. Faith and fragility. From Spain's view, the Eastern Empire stretched like a star's long tail, beautiful, distant, and hard to hold. The galleons came and went. The churches were built. But control was never perfect. The distance from Madrid to Manila was vast, measured not only in miles, but in time, weather, and will. Local revolts erupted in Luzon and Visayas. Indigenous groups resisted taxation and forced labor. In the south, Muslim leaders repelled Spanish advances again and again, holding fast to their land and beliefs. In China and Japan, where Spain hoped to expand its influence, tolerance ran thin. Christianity was first welcomed, then outlawed. missionaries were expelled. Some were executed. Even within Manila, cracks appeared. Rivalries grew between church and state. Spanish officials sometimes clashed with the clergy. Corruption bled through the ranks. Silver could buy loyalty, but only for so long. The empire was growing on maps, in coins, in cathedrals, but so were its weaknesses. Like a great galleon heavy with cargo, it creaked under its own weight. And always, the ocean waited, reminding Spain that nothing built on water could stand forever. Still, the faith endured. Even as control wavered, the church remained rooted. Christianity took hold in the Philippines more deeply than in almost any other Asian nation. It reshaped daily life. Festivals, marriages, burials. It changed names, calendars, and even the stars people prayed to. Yet for all its strength, the Spanish hold on the East was never more than partial. Their story there was not of total conquest, but of a slow, wandering journey. A ship sailing into fog, a mission walking into mist, a vision both grand and fragile, lit by candlelight, fading into the sea. Chapter 12. Viceroys and the Paper Empire. In the high plateau of central Mexico, where volcanic peaks watch over the valley like stone guardians, a new city rose upon the ruins of the old. Where once the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan had stood, its temples shimmering over the lake, now rose Mexico City, the beating heart of Spain's dominion in the New World. It was from here, in stone halls patterned after Madrid's own palaces, that Spain sought to govern half a world away. This was the viceroyalty of New Spain, created in 1535, and ruled by a man who served as the king's shadow across the ocean, the viceroy. He rode in carriages beneath banners of gold, held court in echoing chambers, and signed his name to orders that shaped lives from the deserts of northern Mexico to the jungles of Central America. Yet for all his grandeur, the viceroy was not a king. He was a steward, a guardian of the crown's will. His power was real, but borrowed. In time, more viceroyalties followed. Peru, New Granada, the Rio de la Plata. These vast territories were divided into audiencias and provinces, each with governors and judges who reported back in long handwritten letters, words crossing seas in wooden chests, folded between wax and hope. The new world became a mirror of the old, but the reflection was never perfect. Palaces rose, yes, but so did plantations and prisons. The viceroys wore silk. Their courts glittered, but outside their walls, native communities rebuilt their lives under new laws and new burdens. Some collaborated, others resisted. Many simply endured, generation after generation. In this world of ritual and rank, of ceremonies and commands, the crown of Spain gleamed on altars and flags, but its true weight rested in the routines of rule, the quiet grind of governance. It was here, in ledgers and offices, that empire took root. The Council of the Indies, thousands of miles away. In the city of Seville, another kind of empire hummed, one of parchment, ink, and decisions whispered behind carved wooden doors. This was the Council of the Indies, the royal body charged with overseeing all things American. Its members were jurists, bishops, and noblemen, whose days began not with swords or spears, but with documents, petitions, reports, and laws, each sealed with the authority of the king. The council's chambers were quiet, but the weight of the world pressed upon them. Here, maps were studied. Here, complaints from governors were read aloud. Here, justice was written, sometimes slowly, sometimes swiftly, but always with the belief that words could rule as firmly as war. The council could appoint viceroys, review laws, and order the construction of missions, ports and forts, and, though it sat in Europe, its reach extended across 2 oceans. The Council of the Indies worked closely with the Casa de Contratación, an institution responsible for controlling trade, shipping and travel between Spain and its colonies. Together, they formed the mind of the empire. Ships might carry silver and spices, but it was these councils that decided what could be loaded, what taxes must be paid, and who could sail. In many ways, the Spanish Empire became a paper empire. Orders were written in triplicate, reports copied by hand, decisions debated, revised and archived in towering shelves. The bureaucracy was immense. To be governed by Spain was to be governed by forms, licenses for marriage, permits for travel, permissions for trade, all passed through offices that moved slowly, carefully, and with layers of approval. To an outsider, it might seem sluggish, but in that slowness was a kind of stability. The empire did not rush. It moved with the patience of parchment, believing that what was written could last longer than what was conquered. Pen and sword. In theory, the Spanish colonies were ruled by law and loyalty, but in practice, power had its hierarchies. At the top stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe. They were the viceroys, bishops, governors, and generals. They arrived with authority, often backed by family wealth or royal favor. They spoke with the accent of Castile and carried with them the confidence of the old world. Beneath them stood the criollos, or Creoles, Spaniards born in the Americas. They were landowners, merchants, soldiers, and scholars. They were as Catholic, as Spanish, and often as wealthy as their European cousins. But they were not treated the same. They could rarely hold the highest posts. Their loyalty was trusted, but never fully rewarded. And over time, that gap began to grow, not just in income, but in identity. The Creoles began to see themselves as something distinct. They were not indigenous, but they were not quite European either. They were Americans, Spanish in heritage, but shaped by different skies, different lands, and different histories. They knew the seasons of sugar and silver. They understood the rhythms of local trade. And though they served the empire, many began to wonder if the empire truly served them. Still, for much of the colonial period, the system held. The pen wielded authority. The sword enforced it. Spanish soldiers patrolled the coasts. Fortresses rose in Havana, Cartagena, and San Juan. Pirates tested Spain's reach, but they found cannon and command waiting. Rebellions broke out, but they were crushed with reports and rifles. The balance was fragile. Power was written in paper but held in hands, and as long as the Creoles stayed quiet, the system endured. But quiet does not mean content, and beneath the surface, something was stirring. The burden of distance. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the Spanish Empire was not rebellion, or rivals, or wealth. It was distance. A message from Mexico City to Madrid could take 6 months, or more. News of a revolt might arrive long after the dust had settled. A royal decree intended to prevent injustice might be read years after the injustice had passed. The empire lived in delay. Orders were outdated before they were opened. Ships were lost to storms. Letters were intercepted by enemies. And often, local officials had no choice but to act first and explain later. Viceroys became improvisers. Judges became diplomats. Bishops became peacekeepers. Authority meant adapting, not simply obeying. To rule such a far-flung empire required more than force. It required equilibrium, a slow-moving balance between center and edge, between crown and colony, between the world imagined in Madrid and the world lived in Lima or Quito. This balance was delicate, held together by faith in the system and fear of losing it. In some places, local councils, called cabildos, took on greater responsibility. They resolved disputes, managed markets, and cared for public works. These town councils, often led by Creoles, became the quiet heartbeat of colonial life. They were not rebellious, but they were rooted, and in time, their influence would grow. For now, though, the system held. The empire moved like a great ship under sail, not quickly, not always smoothly, but with direction. It was steered not just by kings, but by clerks, not just by soldiers, but by scribes. And in its own slow way, it endured, because it had to. Chapter 13, the Encomienda and the Price of Peace. When the Spanish crown first laid claim to the Americas, its power came not only from soldiers and swords, but from something quieter, something rooted in tradition, law, and the quiet exchange of land and labor. To reward their loyal conquistadors, Spain granted them encomiendas. Not land ownership, but something more influential. These were rights over people, indigenous people. Entire communities were assigned to Spanish settlers, and with that assignment came the expectation of tribute, obedience, and labor. At first, the system looked like feudalism as practiced in medieval Spain. In exchange for protection and Christian instruction, native peoples were to give goods, services, and work. On paper, the arrangement promised care. In practice, it offered control. The new lords, Spanish men, some barely literate, others once soldiers of fortune, now ruled like nobles. Their estates spread wide across valleys and plains. The people who had lived there for generations were now their labor force. The encomenderos built churches and houses. They harvested maize and sugar. They oversaw mines and mills. Some governed gently, others harshly. But the imbalance was clear. Power flowed in one direction, and the system turned people into possessions. Across Mexico, Central America, and the Andes, the same pattern repeated. A Spanish lord, an indigenous community, and a promise that always seemed to benefit one side more than the other. The old world had planted itself firmly in the new. It grew not from seeds, but from commands, written on parchment, sealed by kings, enforced with quiet force. Over time, some encomiendas became vast estates. Others were passed down through generations. They shaped towns, traditions, and borders. And through it all, the Spanish crown looked on, sometimes with pride, sometimes with worry. Because even as Spain ruled, it knew that control, when built on suffering, was never easy to hold. The native dilemma. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the arrival of the encomienda brought a strange and painful shift. Life had already changed after conquest. Cities burned, temples toppled, languages pushed aside. Now came another change, a new kind of belonging. One that tied them to Spanish settlers not through family or faith, but through obligation. They were no longer free in the way they once were, but neither were they slaves in the legal sense. They were caught in a grey space. Subjects of the king, Christians in name, yet bound to work fields they once called their own. They were expected to offer tribute, maize, cotton, salt, sometimes gold. And they were required to labor. The labor took many forms. Men carried stones for churches, built roads, and toiled in the hot sun of sugar plantations. Women wove cloth or cooked for Spanish households. Children helped in the fields. Entire families became part of a cycle they could not escape. And yet they remained communities. They kept their languages, their festivals, their quiet forms of resistance. Conversion to Christianity was both a pressure and a shield. Priests demanded baptism. But once baptized, indigenous people gained certain rights under Spanish law. It was a bitter trade. Accept a new god to gain a little protection. Some accepted. Some blended their old beliefs into the new. Others resisted, in ways the Spanish could not always see, in prayers whispered in native tongues, in dances that masked ancient meanings, in dreams passed down through generations. To live under Encomienda was to live between two worlds, to be both visible and invisible, valuable but not valued. And yet, despite the weight of the system, the people endured. Their stories bent but did not break. The voice of Las Casas. Among the many who watched this system unfold, one man stood apart, not in power, but in conscience. His name was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who had once owned an encomienda himself. He came to believe that the system was not only unjust, it was a wound to the soul of Spain. In sermons, in letters, and in books, Las Casas described what he had seen: the forced labor, the suffering, the loss. He wrote of villages emptied by disease and despair, of people who bent under burdens not of their making. He spoke not to silence the empire, but to awaken it. He argued that the native peoples of the Americas were not savages, but rational beings with cultures, families, and dignity. He pleaded with the king to end the Encomienda system, to recognize the full humanity of the indigenous. His most famous work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, shocked Europe. In it, he described atrocities in painful detail, not to accuse, but to call for change. Las Casas was not alone, but his voice was among the loudest. He debated other priests. He spoke before kings. And he returned again and again to the same truth. An empire built on cruelty could not last. Some heard him. In 1542, the Spanish crown issued the new laws, aimed at limiting the abuses of encomienda and ending hereditary claims, but implementation was slow. Resistance came not only from colonists, but from a system already too deeply rooted. Still, Las Casas persisted. He lived long, wrote much, and died with hope, though not victory. His fight marked a turning point, not an end to injustice, but the beginning of a voice against it. A reminder that within empire, even small voices could echo far. From tribute to tax. Over time, the encomienda began to fade, not from moral awakening alone, but from shifts in economics, politics, and practicality. As the centuries passed, new systems rose in its place, less visible, but still controlling. The tribute that once flowed through personal hands was now collected by officials. The labor that had been forced began to change into wage labor. Small, pay for hard work, but still a form of choice, however limited. But the shift was not clean. For many, the burdens remained the same. They still worked long hours for little gain. They still gave a portion of their crops. The faces of the overseers changed, but the structures held. The names changed. Hacienda, repartimiento, peonage. But the weight did not. Some encomenderos became landlords. Some villages remained tied to estates through debt, not decree. The laws grew more complex, but the outcome stayed familiar. Inequality woven into daily life. Still, something had shifted. Indigenous communities began to organize. They filed petitions in Spanish courts. They sent leaders to argue cases in faraway capitals. They used the tools of empire, paper, law, language, to push back. Sometimes they won, sometimes they were ignored, but they spoke, and beneath it all, the memory of Encommenda lingered. It became part of the land's story, etched into the hills, remembered in families, echoed in songs. The price of peace for Spain had been the management of people, and that peace had come with deep cost, measured not only in lives lost, but in trust broken. The Encommenda system had promised order. What it left was a legacy of inequality that would stretch far beyond the days of empire. Chapter 14: Revolts, Ghosts, and Forgotten Gods. In the silence of mountains and deserts, far from the echo of palaces and cathedrals, unrest slowly stirred beneath the surface of the Spanish Empire. Though the cross had been raised and laws had been written, the hearts of many remained heavy with loss and longing. For generations, indigenous peoples had lived under Spanish rule. They had been baptized, they had been taxed, but they had not forgotten. And sometimes, when the weight of empire grew too great, they rose. Uprisings flared across the colonies, like sparks on dry grass. Some came in swift violence, arrows and machetes against muskets. Others moved more quietly, in whispers, in chants, in fires lit on distant hills. In Peru, in the Andes, rebellion returned again and again. The memory of the Inca had not faded. Names like Manco Inca and Tupac Amaru became symbols, first of blood, then of hope. In New Spain, scattered revolts broke out in villages where the tribute was too heavy or the cruelty too sharp. Often, the rebels were farmers, shepherds, weavers, ordinary, people driven by extraordinary pain. They were crushed, more often than not, their names erased or remembered only in fear. But their resistance lived on, buried in stories, passed down like seeds beneath the snow. And sometimes, rebellion wore robes. In some villages, Catholic rituals became a shield, a cover under which old rites could hide. Crosses were carried, in one hand, but in the other was memory. Processions marched with saints, but the steps followed older rhythms. The rosary was said aloud, while ancestral prayers were whispered beneath breath. The empire believed it had peace. But peace, when enforced, is only quiet, and in that quiet, something waited. Something that did not forget the gods of the mountains or the songs of the forest. The cult of the Virgin and the feathered serpent. The Spanish brought with them statues of saints, images of the Virgin Mary, and tales of miracles performed in distant lands. These became tools of conversion, softened messages wrapped in beauty and mystery. Churches were built upon ancient temples. Altars stood where old shrines once burned. But beneath these new symbols, something unexpected happened. The old gods did not vanish. They changed their names. In Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared, not just as a Christian figure, but as something more. She was cloaked in stars. She stood upon the moon. Her face was brown. To many indigenous people, she resembled Tonantzin, the mother goddess. Her shrine rose near a place once sacred to Aztec faith, and in her eyes, some saw both comfort and return. The Spanish saw conversion. The people saw continuity. Elsewhere, the feathered serpent, the ancient god Quetzalcoatl, reappeared in murals and symbols, often hidden, sometimes blended with Christian stories. Saints were carved with feathered cloaks. Angels wore sandals and bore maize instead of swords. In the highlands, mountain spirits became holy protectors, and water deities were invoked during baptisms. It was not open defiance, it was adaptation. The people had learned to survive under the watchful eye of empire, and survival meant learning to speak in two voices at once. In Peru, the sun god Inti was remembered through festivals that now celebrated Catholic feasts. In Guatemala, Mayan calendars continued in secret, while church bells marked European time. What looked like surrender was, in truth, a slow reshaping, a quiet weaving together of old and new. The Spanish believed they were changing the souls of the Americas, but the Americas were also changing them, slowly, steadily, and deeply. The Pueblo Revolt. In the dry lands of what is now the American Southwest, a story unfolded that would shake the Spanish Empire's hold in ways few could have imagined. It began not with armies, but with a people pushed too far. The Pueblo peoples, farmers, potters and weavers, had long lived along the Rio Grande, building adobe homes and worshipping their ancestors beneath desert skies. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they brought missions, friars and soldiers. They banned native ceremonies, burned sacred objects, and forced labor for churches and farms. For decades, resentment grew like cracks in the earth. Droughts came, famine followed, disease ravaged the land, and with every loss, the anger deepened. Then, in 1680, under the leadership of a man named Pope, the Pueblo peoples united. From Taos to Acoma, messengers ran between villages, passing cords tied with knots to mark the days until revolt. When Nansei, the moment came, they struck. The missions burned, the friars were driven out, the Spanish settlers fled south. For over a decade, New Mexico was free of Spanish rule. The Pueblos rebuilt their lives, restored their ceremonies, and breathed without empire's weight. It was the most successful indigenous revolt in the history of Spanish America. And though Spain would return in 1692, the world had changed. The Pueblos had proven that resistance was possible, that unity could win, at least for a time. Even after reconquest, the Spanish ruled differently. They allowed some religious freedom. They built fewer missions. The revolt had left a mark. It was not just a rebellion, it was a memory etched into the land, a reminder that the spirit of a people cannot be erased. A faith transformed. As decades turned to centuries, the Spanish Empire continued its slow march, through law, through trade, through faith. But beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted. The Catholicism that had arrived with crosses and commandments was no longer the same. It had been touched by the soil, the people, the sky of the Americas. In Mexico, in Peru, in the Philippines, and beyond, Christianity did not remain unchanged. It absorbed local rhythms. It bent to local languages. Saints became part of family trees. Prayers were whispered in voices that once spoke only to the rain and the corn. Processions took on the colors of old rituals. Candles flickered before, images that held more than one meaning. The church saw growth in numbers, in influence, but also change. In time, even the clergy began to reflect the lands they served. Indigenous priests, mestizo friars, and native deacons rose within the ranks. The gospel was preached not only from pulpits, but from mountaintops and riversides. And yet the wounds remained. The conquest, the forced conversions, the suppression of culture, all left scars. But from those scars, something unexpected bloomed. A new faith, not entirely Spanish, not entirely native, but something born of both. It was a faith with two hearts. One beat with the drums of old ceremonies, the other with the tolling of church bells. Together, they made something resilient, The Spanish Empire had hoped to baptize the world into its image, but in doing so, it was itself reshaped, softened by the very people it sought to command. And as the empire aged, that truth became harder to ignore. Faith had spread, yes, but it had not conquered. It had been woven into something older, something deeper, something that would outlast the empire itself. Chapter 15: The Empire of Paper and Smoke. At the peak of its power, the Spanish Empire was not just a kingdom, it was a world. It stretched across oceans and over mountains, threading its banners through deserts, jungles, and distant islands. From the palace walls of Seville to the crowded markets of Lima, from the stone towers of Manila to the cattle plains of Buenos Aires, it seemed the sun truly never set on Spain's reach. But what looks strong from a distance often hides quiet, strain. Beneath the majesty of maps and missions, the empire was being stretched by its size, by its ambition, by the very weight of its own victories. Ships carried silver and silk, but letters took months to cross the sea. Decisions made in Madrid arrived too late in Mexico. Orders issued in Seville were outdated by the time they reached Peru. Across the empire, local governors, intended to serve as eyes and hands of the crown, began to move like kings in their own right. Some followed orders, others made their own. In New Spain, the viceroys built grand palaces and hosted courts with music and fine wine. In Peru, bishops debated policy, while merchants built fortunes that rivaled those of Spanish nobles. Each territory became its own reflection of power, part mirror, part mirage. The empire ruled, but its voice grew distant, and in that distance, others began to speak louder. Paper moved faster than kings. Laws were copied and interpreted differently from colony to colony. Bureaucracy bloomed like ivy, wrapping around itself, hard to trim, impossible to uproot. What had begun as a single empire began to feel like many. And while the banners still flew, the winds that held them aloft were shifting. Pirates and privateers, as Spain's treasure fleet sailed from the Americas to Europe, glittering with silver and promise, shadows began to gather on the seas. Pirates, once little more than desperate sailors, grew bolder. Privateers, hired by rival crowns, stalked the waves like ghosts. England, France, and the Netherlands, rising powers with hungry eyes, began to bite at the edges of Spain's golden roots. They came in fast ships, painted black and armed with fire. In the Caribbean, the once calm ports of Havana and Cartagena became targets. In the Pacific, even the galleons of Manila were not safe. Spanish sailors whispered names in fear: Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Piet Hein. These were not kings, but they had power of a different kind, the power of disruption. Fortresses were built to defend the coasts. Stone walls rose in San Juan and Veracruz. Cannons were mounted along harbors, bells installed to warn of incoming sails. But the threat could never be fully stopped. The empire's arteries were long and exposed, and the enemies were many. Trade slowed. Insurance rose. Merchants grew cautious. Some ships never arrived, others returned empty. The oceans that had once been highways of silver were now battlefields of smoke and flame. And still, the empire tried to protect what it had built. More soldiers were sent, more taxes collected, but for every fort constructed, another ship was lost. For every coin minted, another was stolen. Spain still ruled the waves, but no longer alone, and in those waves, the echoes of future powers began to grow louder. The cost of glory. Even as silver continued to pour into Spain's treasury, the shine began to dim. Wealth had built cities, bought palaces, and fed armies. But wealth, once depended upon too deeply, becomes fragile. Spain had not invested in its own industries. It had borrowed, it had spent, and now it owed. The costs of empire were more than coins. They were counted in soldiers, in ships, in grain, in blood. Endless wars in Europe against the Dutch, the English, the French drained more than money. They drained spirit. They pulled young men from villages to die on foreign fields. They filled cemeteries faster than the empire could fill coffers. Inflation rose at home. The more silver arrived, the less it was worth. Prices climbed, bread became scarce. The people grumbled, and though Spain still wore its crown, the jewels began to feel heavy. In the colonies, frustration grew. Taxes increased. Labor demands intensified. Officials demanded more tribute, more obedience, more faith. But beneath it all, a question lingered. How long could this last? Mutinies broke out in distant posts, revolts simmered, and even within the government, doubt began to grow. The dream of global rule, once so clear, so golden, now flickered, like a candle in the wind. It had not yet failed, but it no longer felt invincible, and in that doubt, cracks formed. Not loud or sudden, but quiet and slow, like wood shifting beneath too much weight. The gentle fade empires rarely end with a bang. Most do not fall, they fade. And the Spanish Empire, for all its power and glory, followed this soft path. Its banners still waved, its ships still sailed, its officials still issued commands, but the fire that once drove it forward had begun to cool. The 1600s passed into the 1700s. The age of conquest gave way to the age of memory. New powers emerged: Britain, France, the Netherlands, carving out their own empires, faster, leaner, more focused. Spain remained vast, but it moved slowly, caught in the weight of tradition and the tangle of its own systems. Some colonies grew restless. Creoles, Spanish descendants born in the Americas, looked around and saw that their world was changing. They wanted more than obedience. They wanted voice, and in time, they would rise. But for now, the empire still held. It held through habit, through loyalty, through the long echo of history. And for many, life continued as it always had. Church bells, morning markets, the slow rhythm of seasons. The empire for them was not maps or kings. It was the background, the air they breathed. But for those watching closely, the signs were clear. The center was no longer strong enough to hold the edges. The oceans no longer obeyed a single flag, and the future would not belong to a single crown. Spain's empire did not shatter. It softened, like parchment left in the sun, like smoke rising from an extinguished fire, quietly, slowly, without ceremony, but not without meaning. It had shaped the world, changed its languages, redrawn its faiths, rewritten its histories, and now it was becoming history itself. Chapter 16: Seeds of Independence. In the still air of colonial towns, on cobbled streets lined with quiet chapels and sunlit homes, a subtle restlessness began to grow. The Creoles, men and women of Spanish blood born in the Americas, had once seen themselves as proud stewards of Spain's legacy in the New World. They held Spanish customs, spoke Castilian with pride, and sent their children to be educated in the ideals of the homeland. But the soil beneath their feet was not Spanish. It was American. And over time, the land began to shape them more than the crown ever could. The Creoles were often well off, managing vast estates, or engaging in trade. They held some local power, but in the grand order of the empire, they were always second to those born in Spain, the Peninsulares, who arrived with royal commissions and left with titles and wealth. This growing divide between native-born Spaniards and colonial-born Creoles planted seeds of bitterness. It was not an open revolt, not yet, but it was a growing question, whispered in private gatherings and echoing through books. Why, if we are Spaniards, are we treated as less? The 1700s brought new currents of thought, slowly drifting across the Atlantic. Creoles, educated in Jesuit schools and European universities, absorbed the writings of Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. The Enlightenment was not just a European affair. It arrived on ships, in letters, and in the thoughts of young men who began to dream of rights, reason, and reform. Philosophy began to challenge faith as the sole guide, and reason became a tool for justice. In places like Mexico City, Lima, Bogota, and Caracas, learned Creoles formed literary salons and scientific societies. They studied astronomy, debated, government, and translated French texts into Spanish. Their gatherings were still loyal to Spain, but their minds wandered. They admired Spanish culture, but they longed for something more. A voice, a place, a future that wasn't dictated from across the sea. Slowly, a Creole identity began to form. Not fully Spanish, not fully native, but something new. The empire had raised them, but it did not see them as equals. And in this quiet contradiction, a movement began, not yet with guns or banners, but with thought, with doubt, with awakening. Bourbon reforms. When the Bourbon dynasty replaced the Habsburgs, in the early 18th century, the Spanish Empire entered a new era, one of discipline, efficiency, and central control. The Bourbon kings, influenced by the administrative models of France, saw the empire not as a collection of loyal provinces, but as a vast machine to be tightened, tuned, and taxed. Reform became their tool. And though it was meant to strengthen the empire, it began to expose its weaknesses. The Bourbon reforms touched every corner of colonial life. Viceroys were reshuffled, new administrators installed, and the old Creole elites found themselves squeezed by layers of bureaucracy imported from Madrid. The colonial treasury, once relatively independent, now faced stricter accounting and higher demands. Taxes rose sharply, not just on goods and silver, but on daily life. From tobacco to alcohol, from landholdings to indigenous labor, everything was measured, recorded, and taxed. Trade, once a bustling affair between colonies and Spain, was strangled by new restrictions. Only select ports could operate legally. Commerce between colonies, such as between Peru and New Granada or Mexico and the Philippines, was frowned upon or outright banned. The empire was being reorganized, but in doing so, it lost its natural rhythms. What once functioned through local custom now faltered under distant rule. In cities across Latin America, discontent simmered. Spanish officials replaced Creole magistrates. New taxes drained small farmers. Guilds were stripped of their privileges. And while the reforms boosted Spain's income, they drained the colonies of trust. The Creoles, already feeling the sting of exclusion, now felt outright targeted. They were told the changes were for their benefit. But the benefits, as always, flowed eastward across the sea. The goal was control. The cost was resentment. The reforms may have brought order, but they also shattered the illusion that the colonies were partners in empire. Instead, they revealed the truth. Spain ruled, and the colonies served. And once that truth was seen, it could not be unseen. Smugglers and scholars As trade laws tightened and taxes climbed, a shadow economy began to bloom. Along the coasts and through the mountains, smugglers carried goods not approved by the crown. English fabrics, Dutch tools, and French wines entered colonial markets through quiet coves and hidden trails. But more than goods, ideas came with them. Ideas that slipped through the cracks of empire like light through a cracked window. Books banned in Spain found eager readers in the Americas. Smugglers did not only carry silk and sugar, they carried volumes by Voltaire, pamphlets from Boston, and newspapers from Paris. In private rooms above taverns and behind bookshops, colonists read of revolutions in faraway lands. They read of reason, of freedom, of the rights of man. They read of a world where kings could be questioned and governments could be changed. Scholars and priests became unexpected allies in this quiet resistance. Jesuits, often critical of royal overreach, preserved ancient texts and encouraged inquiry. Secular thinkers, once cautious, began to speak more boldly. The universities, once echo chambers of theology, now taught science, law, and political theory. A generation was growing up, not with blind loyalty to Spain, but with a growing hunger for change. In port cities like Havana, Cartagena, and Buenos Aires, smuggling was an open secret. Entire economies depended on the black market. Spanish law may have outlawed foreign trade, but colonial life demanded it. And with each shipment of contraband, both goods and ideas flowed into the veins of the empire, nourishing a quiet revolution. It was not yet a call to arms. It was a whisper of possibility, a thought barely formed. What if we governed ourselves? What if Spain is not the answer, but the problem? The empire still stood, tall and golden, but beneath its surface, the currents had begun to shift. The first sparks. The 18th century did not end quietly. In the highlands of Peru and the valleys of Mexico, rebellion flared, briefly, bloodily, and with consequences that would echo for decades. These were not coordinated revolutions, but early cries from a people pushed too far. They were the first, sparks, and though they were swiftly put out, the smoke lingered. In 1780, in the Andes of southern Peru, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui, later known as Tupac Amaru II, rose in revolt. Claiming descent from Inca royalty, he called not only for the end of Spanish abuses, but for justice for the indigenous peoples who had suffered under colonial rule. His rebellion gathered thousands, indigenous and mestizo alike, and for a time, it seemed the empire itself might shake. But Spain struck back with overwhelming force. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders captured and executed with brutal public display. Yet the memory could not be erased. Tupac Amaru's name became a symbol, a wound, and a warning. A few years later, in 1810, another rebellion would erupt in Mexico. Led by a priest named Miguel Hidalgo, it would declare an outright break from Spain. But that story lies ahead. For now, it was only in whispers, only in fields, classrooms, and hearts that had tasted the idea of freedom. These early sparks did not bring down the empire, but they proved that fire could spread, that the dream of independence was no longer unthinkable. Spain still ruled the Americas, but the silence was broken. In every corner of the empire, from the Andes to the Caribbean, the dream had taken root, and dreams, once awakened, do not sleep again. Chapter 17. When the sun begins to set. The dawn of the 19th century arrived not with peace, but with thunder. Across Europe, the ground trembled under the weight of a single name: Napoleon. His armies moved like storms, crossing borders, breaking kings, and rewriting the order of the continent. In 1808, the storm reached Spain. The French emperor, seeing weakness in the old Bourbon crown, invaded. Spanish resistance was fierce, but it could not prevent the inevitable. The king, Charles IV, was forced to abdicate. His son, Ferdinand VII, followed. In their place, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Spain, proud and ancient, was now a kingdom ruled by a foreigner. The invasion threw the entire Spanish world into confusion. In Madrid, rebellion sparked and spread. Across the countryside, guerrilla fighters rose up against the French. But far from the battlefields of Iberia, in the mountains and jungles of the Americas, another crisis was growing. Without a clear king, the colonists asked, who now holds the right to rule? For centuries, loyalty to the Spanish monarch had been the glue holding the empire together. Even those who grumbled at taxes and distance had still sworn allegiance to the crown. But now the crown was gone, or at least it was no longer worn by someone they recognized. Should they support Joseph Bonaparte? Should they remain loyal to Ferdinand, even in exile? Or was it time to choose something else entirely? In cities from Caracas to Lima, from Bogotá to Buenos Aires, colonial leaders formed juntas, councils that claimed to rule in the name of the true king. But behind this show of loyalty, deeper questions stirred. If the old world had collapsed in Europe, might a new world rise in the Americas? Spain's hold had always depended on distance, obedience, and time. Now, with confusion in the homeland and ambition awakening in the colonies, those bonds began to fray. The shadow of Napoleon had reached across the Atlantic, not just to conquer, but to ignite. And in that flickering light, rebellion began to form. The cry of freedom, the spark of independence, once faint and cautious, now burst into flame. In the highlands of central Mexico in 1810, a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla stood before his congregation. With urgency in his voice and fire in his heart, he cried out for rebellion. His call, known as the Grito de Dolores, was more than just a sermon. It was a trumpet blast. He called not just for political change, but for justice, dignity, and the end of centuries of inequality. Within days, thousands followed him. Farmers, workers, and the poor carried clubs, machetes, and hope. Hidalgo's march was fierce but short-lived. He was captured and executed less than a year later. Yet his voice did not die. It echoed through the valleys and hills, taken up by others. In Venezuela, a young aristocrat named Simón Bolívar believed the time had come. Trained in Europe, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, Bolívar saw independence not as rebellion, but as destiny. He fought through jungle and mountain, exiled and returned, lost and won. Again and again, he rallied men to the cause of freedom. Further south in Argentina, José de San Martín planned quietly and struck with purpose. A military man with discipline in his blood, he crossed the Andes with a force no one thought possible. His campaign through Chile and into Peru helped crack the last defenses of Spanish rule in South America. The cry of freedom was not one voice. It was a chorus. In Cuba, whispers began. In Central America, protests stirred. The continent, once silenced by fear, had found its voice. These movements were not without chaos. Power shifted, alliances broke, and dreams clashed with reality. But beneath the disorder, the message was clear. The Americas would no longer be ruled from afar. What began as scattered revolts became coordinated campaigns. Leaders emerged, not as servants of Spain, but as founders of new nations. By the 1820s, the fire was unstoppable. Across plains, through forests, over rivers and ridges, the cause of independence marched forward. Some fought for liberty, others for revenge, some for new power, but all, in their own way, fought to bring an end to an empire that had long forgotten how to listen. The long goodbye. The Spanish Empire did not fall in a single blow. It collapsed in waves, slow, bitter, and relentless. The fight for independence was not swift, nor was it clean. It was a long goodbye, written in blood and shaped by battle. In Mexico, after Hidalgo's death, the struggle continued under leaders like José María Morelos and Vicente Guerrero. Years of war turned the countryside into a graveyard of hope and violence. Cities were taken and lost. Villages burned. Families chose sides and paid dearly for it. The dream of freedom came at a high price. In South America, Bolívar's vision of a united continent faced constant threats. He fought not just Spanish armies, but rival leaders, shifting loyalties, and the weight of expectation. The wars wore on year after year, reshaping borders and leaving scars that would last for generations. Spain, for its part, did not give up easily. Even after losing control of much of the continent, it poured money, men, and ships into the fight. Royalist strongholds held firm in Peru and Upper Peru, modern-day Bolivia. Loyalists dug in, believing they could reverse the tide, but they could not hold back time. The empire was bleeding, and the will to resist began to weaken. By the mid-1820s, most of Spanish America had broken free. Battles still raged, but the outcome was clear. Spain could no longer rule a land so distant, so vast, and so determined to be free. Its armies were tired, its people divided, its coffers drained. The age of conquest had turned into the age of retreat. Yet even as new flags rose, the farewell was not simple. The old ways lingered. Colonial structures remained. Class divisions endured. Independence brought promise, but also challenge. Nations were born, but they were fragile. The goodbye to Spain was long, and in some places, it would take generations to truly let go. Only ashes remain. By the 1830s, the Spanish Empire in the Americas had all but vanished. The once golden thread that stretched from California to Cape Horn was cut. Province by province, the empire had slipped away, not just through war, but through will. What remained were only scattered pieces. Cuba and Puerto Rico still flew the Spanish flag, but they were shadows of a past now fading. The empire that had once claimed to be the land where the sun never set had lost its light. Its glory days, when ships filled with silver sailed to Seville, and when conquistadors planted crosses and flags across continents, were now memories. The grand cathedrals, the stone fortresses, and the plazas once built to impress still stood. But their purpose had shifted. They belong now to new nations, with new dreams. Spain itself, battered by war and political crisis, entered a century of struggle. At home, the monarchy staggered between rulers, revolutions, and civil wars. Abroad, its power was spent. The world had changed. Europe was industrializing. Empires were growing elsewhere. Spain, once the mightiest of all, was now learning how to live with loss. For the people of the Americas, the ashes left behind were both a burden and a beginning. They had inherited the bones of empire, its roads, its laws, its languages, but also its wounds. They now faced the task of building something new, something their own. The Spanish Empire had been vast, powerful, and deeply flawed. It had spread culture, faith, and cruelty. It had built cities and broken people. It had claimed to civilize, while often silencing. Now, with its fall, a new world could begin to rise, not perfect, not easy, but finally free to choose its own path. The sun had set, and in its place, a different light began to glow, not from across the sea, but from the land itself. Chapter 18. Echoes of Empire. Empires do not disappear all at once. Long after their banners fall, something always remains. And often, the last thing to vanish is the voice, the language that once echoed through courts and colonies, carried by soldiers, priests, and kings. For the Spanish Empire, that voice still lingers. In fact, it never left. Today, Spanish is spoken by hundreds of millions, from the dry deserts of northern Mexico to the southern tip of Patagonia, from Havana's narrow alleys to the highlands of Bolivia. The language of Spain became something new, shared, reshaped, and rooted in the soil of the Americas. When Spanish first arrived with ships and steel, it was the language of command. Orders were barked in Castilian, prayers were whispered in Latin, then translated into the tongue of empire. Indigenous people were taught to confess in Spanish, to marry in Spanish, to be judged in Spanish. And yet, over time, the language bent. In the mouths of the native-born, in the homes of mestizos and Creoles, Spanish mixed with native rhythms, Nahuatl, Quechua, Guarani. These languages whispered into the empire's tongue, giving it flavor, life, and difference. The result was not a copy of the old world, but something unique. Words changed, accents formed, grammar bent under the weight of memory. The Spanish spoken in Madrid is not the same as the Spanish in Quito or Santo Domingo or Buenos Aires, and that, in itself, is the legacy of empire. Not perfect imitation, but lasting presence. A voice that was once foreign became familiar, even beloved. Today, the Spanish language is carried by songs, by poems, by lullabies, sung by grandmothers. It is taught in schools and heard on radios, passed down not by conquerors, but by parents to children. It no longer belongs to a single nation. It belongs to a world that once knelt beneath a crown, but now walks in its own direction. Empires fall, borders shift, but language endures. And so, the Spanish Empire, though long gone, still speaks. Churches in the jungle. Across the landscape of the Americas, stone rises from green. In the heart of the jungle, in the quiet valleys, and atop sunlit hills, churches stand. Some towering, others crumbling, all shaped by the same hand. These cathedrals, chapels, and missions were built not just with stone, but with belief. They replaced temples, reshaped sacred spaces, and redrew the spiritual map of a continent. The Spanish Empire, driven as much by faith as by gold, spread. Not only rule but religion. When the conquistadors came, they came with priests. Behind the blade came the Bible. And in every corner of the empire, crosses were raised. Pyramids were torn down or built over. Bells rang out where chants once echoed. The saints of Spain replaced the gods of the native world, or tried to. But faith is not so easily rewritten. The people of the Americas did not forget. In secret corners, they remembered their ancestors. In the candlelit shadows of the new churches, they whispered old names. And over generations, A new kind of belief formed, one that blended the sacred with the ancient. In Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe became more than a Catholic figure. She became a symbol of identity, a merging of two worlds. In the Andes, processions for saints echoed the rhythms of Inca festivals. Drums mixed with hymns. Dancers honored both Christ and the mountains. The church was everywhere. But so too was the memory of what came before. Today, visitors can walk through cities where grand churches cast long shadows. Some still hold mass each morning. Others stand quiet, their walls cracked by time. Yet in all of them, history breathes. These are not just monuments to Spain. They are living proof of what was taken, what was given, and what endured. The empire left faith, but that faith, shaped by pain and hope, became something new. Not Spanish, not native, but a reflection of both. The bones beneath the streets. Beneath the bustling cities of Latin America lie two stories, one built on top of the other. Step through the markets of Mexico City and you stand above the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Walk the streets of Lima or Quito or Bogotá and you walk over bones, stone bones of empires long gone, human bones of those who built them, and silent memories that whisper through the ground. The Spanish Empire did not just rule by decree, it ruled by brick and mortar. It tore down temples to build palaces. It reshaped roads, redrew plazas, and renamed rivers. Yet in its construction, it could never fully erase what was there before. In the soil, in the shape of hills, in the names that refused to die, the native world remained. Archaeologists today uncover layers like pages in a book. Beneath churches, they find pyramids. Beneath government buildings, they find offerings to gods whose names the empire tried to forget. And in graveyards, both grand and humble, they find the stories of those who lived between two worlds, forced to serve one, but born of another. Even above ground, the legacy is clear. Spanish cities were laid out in grids, with the church at the center. Streets stretched in perfect lines, symbolizing order. But over time, life filled those grids with chaos, color, and soul. Indigenous markets, Afro-Caribbean rhythms, mestizo neighborhoods, all these grew around the planned core, reshaping it. The bones beneath the streets remind us, nothing ever fully disappears. The past is not lost, it is layered. And the Spanish Empire, for all its effort to dominate, ended up building atop a world it could never fully silence. What was buried still breathes. The sun sets quietly. There was no grand farewell, no final trumpet, no last royal decree to mark the end. The Spanish Empire faded not in fire, but in quiet retreat. By the time the last colonies were lost, the world had already moved on. New powers rose, new flags flew, and Spain, once the master of oceans, found itself looking inward, not outward. Yet even as the empire faded, its story remained. In names, in borders, in laws written in colonial ink, the shape of Spain endured. Across the Americas, towns still bear names given centuries ago. San Juan, Santa Fe, Santiago. Legal systems echo Spanish codes. Land grants, court traditions, and even civil structures trace their lines back to Madrid. More than that, there is a memory, a sense even in those who resisted of something vast that once was. For some, the empire is a source of pain, of conquest, of loss. For others, it is heritage, culture, identity. And for many, it is both. It left wounds, but also language. It erased temples, but built cathedrals. It enslaved, yet gave shape to new nations. The Spanish Empire sleeps now. Its banners are folded, its palaces are museums, its ships are stories in books. But its dreams of wealth, of faith, of order and glory still echo, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in protests, sometimes in prayers. History is not clean, it is not kind, but it is ours. And in the soft quiet at the edge of empire, we hear not an ending, but a long breath, a pause, and then perhaps a beginning. For in the silence after the sun sets, the stars begin to appear.